Welcome back to the Demystify Sci podcast. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we are talking about emotions. So, as I feel like I'm often having to say, this is a strange topic for a podcast that is ostensibly titled Science-Related Things. But I think that emotions underlie basically everything that happens in the world. Scientists have this way of going out into the world, of pretending to be this objective lens onto the world where we just look at the data and dispassionately construct a story, but that is so far from the truth of what is actually happening that I think that it's really useful for us to step back and to actually start with a primary examination of what are emotions, where do they come from, how do we understand them, and how do they motivate us? And for this conversation, we have Rex Riepe, who invented something called the Eristics Test. And I came across it on Twitter because somebody was like, hey, this is really weird. This is a really short personality test. And it gave a really, really accurate read on who I am, what I'm motivated by, and has a really interesting and never before seen way of parsing what emotions are. And so I took the test and thought it was really accurate. I made Shiloh take the test. He also thought it was really accurate. And so we contacted Rex to see if Rex could walk us through it, because the results page that you get when you go to eristicstest.com and you actually take the test is a little difficult to parse. So Rex has this really interesting system where when you look at the results, there's these 6 emotional beats that are coupled to each other. So love and disgust are coupled, guilt and pride are coupled, fear and anger are coupled. And he has also a way of encountering the person who's taking the test as being organized into 3 primary arenas, which is the self, the world, and society. And so he's basically able, with 16 questions, to take your responses and to give you this picture of what amounts to being your shadow. It's the things that actually motivate you, despite the fact that there's other surface level perceptions that you may have. And we basically just sit down with him and we take apart the system, how he built it, why he bins emotions as being these 6, why the ones that he sets opposite each other are opposite each other. We take apart Shiloh's Machiavellian personality. We take apart my fear and anxiety-driven personality. And it's just a super interesting conversation that ends up talking about the distributed web, because that's the passion project that Rex spends a lot of his time on.
Machiavellian personality is the pathological end of the dark characteristics.
Absolutely.
I don't think revelatory is the more appropriate way of looking at it.
I think that's true.
I didn't score into the pathological section of them anyways.
No. No pathology is present here.
I'm not 100% evil.
No, not even a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's the most difficult part of this personality test, but also the most interesting is that it focuses on the shadow and the Jungian sense. So the qualities that you come up with are not the ones that you probably want in your byline. But understanding those things about yourself is perhaps the best thing you can do in order to avoid the ultimate fate that they will bring you if you're not aware of them. So this is a cool conversation. We deal with emotional things all the time on this podcast, but we never get to talk about those emotions. So here we are, dealing with emotions at Demystify Sci. By the way, I see Demystify Sci, the title, a little differently than you. I don't see that we're demystifying science per se. I see it as the science of demystifying. Just throwing that out there. Anyways, remember, program's entirely supported by our patrons over at patreon.com/demystifysci. I really need to see you over there. If you're enjoying what's going on here, if you love these episodes, we put a ton of work into cultivating these conversations and finding the right people to talk to, editing them, getting them out every week. 2 of them a week, it's a lot of work, and we could use your support. Keep the lights on.
And we love our patrons. It's an amazing crew of people. We get together every Sunday. We always have fantastic conversations. Everybody's really dedicated to curiosity and learning and exploring nature. And so if you join the Patreon, you get access to that group, and you get to live with the deep satisfaction of having helped a project that you really believe in.
That's right. And it's keeping us from participating in the sales-driven economy otherwise, which is really cool and meaningful to us because we don't sell anything here. We have some t-shirts, actually, if you want to check them out, but we don't make any money off of them. It's just a conversation starter so you can share the show with people.
You can also like, comment, subscribe, share the podcast. Come find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Discord, and we would love to see you at any and all of those places. And first and foremost, before you listen to the rest of the conversation, go to EristicsTest.com, take the test, and then after you have your results page, dive into the conversation, because I think it will be illuminating in unique and interesting ways.
Yeah, and tell us your experiences too down in the comments. I'd love to hear how well it matches your own perception of yourself.
All right, enjoy the conversation, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystified Side Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
So, Shiloh took the personality test this morning.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we've been having some discussions about this.
And it's really interesting because I felt like it was an absolutely perfect description of him. And we immediately got into this discussion about the parameters that are inside the test, because the way that you've broken up this emotional landscape.
Do you mind if I ask what your archetypes were? Or did you want to say that as like a reveal?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, I came up as an architect, the architect. Okay. Yeah, and Nastia comes up as the scientist.
Okay.
Which, on its surface, kind of checks out.
Yeah.
What were you going to say about it?
Shiloh was basically like, okay, so I get it, but I don't understand why the emotions that are primary are overwhelmingly negative. Right, where you have love and pride as perhaps the like really only two positive axes. And then
although pride's the greatest sin.
Pride is the greatest sin. And you have guilt, fear, disgust, and anger as the other ones.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I want to talk more about the way that you can hold on one second, we're having some technical difficulties. Shiloh's trying to screen share. The philosophy behind the study of emotions. To start, yes. Why did you choose these as the primary emotions? Interesting.
Can I just screen share?
So when I sat down to do this, there we go.
There we go. It was just that.
Those six were like one of the first.
So yeah, so this is the
dual nature.
This is the
so
page.
It's like half the work of the philosophy was done on
that
the
you
first
get
day.
once you finish the test.
And then within the philosophy, it like kind of trickles in,
and it breaks down the emotions. And then Shiloh, what were you trying to show?
Revelation prompt.
This is the spread that I get. So I think what Nasi is saying is, so it breaks it down by these, and all of the analyses down below are by these six. Can we call them emotions? What do you call them?
Yeah, I call those six the base emotions.
Base emotions, cool. So I think what we were talking about before the show, after we did these tests, was it seems like these are negatives for me, right? Once I read your definition set, I understand where you're getting at, but the question is why you chose this set, I suppose.
That's a great question. I feel like so few people ask it, but it's also kind of like obvious, like why. Like pretty much every result you get is like these two words that characterize who you are, and then the two words are kind of bad.
Yeah.
This is definitely a problem I'm aware of. But I think that's kind of how all emotions are. I don't want to say they're amoral by nature, but only along a certain axis. So like love and disgust is very like narcissistic and self-centered. For example, so I mean, it is a bad thing. I don't know. Like, people give love a pass, and sometimes people give pride a pass. Everyone kind of agrees on the middle four being like not great things to feel all the time. But I think love's the worst. Like, I would do far worse things out of love than any of the others. Like imagine like protecting like a family member or something. You would do terrible things so that could happen.
Interesting. Okay, so what do you mean by love?
Okay, so love is the argument of the self, and basically it aims to model itself. I'm using model modify. Lately, I'm trying it out. But you could also say it seeks to add to itself more attractively. So it's always arguing for the self, and the self is defined as your physical self, but also like the 5 people closest to you, and sometimes
So
prized
family
possessions.
and family
Yeah.
and friends. So I'm trying to add. So if I love my cat or I love my wife,
Mhm.
that says that I'm trying to include those in myself somehow.
Yeah,
Speaks to
exactly.
that.
Yeah. Now you might have that friend you haven't talked to in a while, and maybe he was previously in your like top 5 or your core self people, and he kind of slipped out of touch. We'll have people like this in our life. So it's kind of a malleable concept. Like people go in, people go out. Pets run away, or
Most people we hear that love is selfless and things like this, a mother's love or
Mhm.
something like that. What do you make of that? Is that that's
I
just
would
whitewashing?
pretty much, yeah, I would go exactly the opposite. I would say, like a lot of people, a lot of philosophers, when they look at emotion or they have in the past, will boil it down to 2 emotions: love and fear. And some of them will call love greed.
Well,
So you want to talk about like negative words to associate with the emotions. Imagine I used greed on my scale, it would be even worse. But I think that's kind of an accurate way to think about it. Like you're definitely greedy on behalf of the people in the shared self. This is sometimes a hard concept to explain to like modern people living comfortable lifestyles. But if things were more primitive and love was just one of the arguments among the other 2, and the other 2 weren't necessarily in agreement, it could get pretty bad on behalf of love. And also disgust. Disgust, it's really obvious, but love is just as bad as disgust. They're the same.
no. What if I love doing something?
The love of an activity, I've thought about that. I think that can be included in the extent itself, but it kind of depends on how you approach it. Like if you go to events centered around that activity and you get involved in a community, that's more of a guilt pride thing. If you just love the mechanics of actually implementing the activity and doing it, that's probably more of a fear anger thing. But if you consider yourself like, oh, I'm Mr. Unicyclist, like I'm the guy that unicycles everywhere, that could be definitely part of yourself.
Mm. So when I say I love something, that might not be. I mean, other people have made this case too. That's not the right way of saying that you enjoy or excited by some activity or motivated by or whatever. It's maybe not the right word, at least with the way that you're using love.
Yeah, definitely possible. And really, with the way we feel emotional beats is it has to be a combination of 2 of the base arguments. So what you would really feel is love and fear at the same time, which is like this into attachment. So it's kind of like it's a self-building, self-modeling emotion. So if you're attached to something, it's part of yourself. So if you're attached to unicycle, you can make the argument. But yeah, even though it's the way it's called, you can't hold it in your hands as part of yourself.
I see. Okay, so I'm starting to grasp this. So when I got my archetype, the architect, I'm given this descriptor revelation, which is a combination of fear and pride. And so you always have these two are they warring emotions? Is that the right way to think about it?
I think in the case of fear and pride, yes. In my own notation of the system, I use lowercase for love, fear, and guilt. So I'll use like lowercase L and lowercase F, lowercase G. And for disgust, anger, pride, I use uppercase. So anytime you have a lowercase emotion, love, fear, and guilt, paired up with a uppercase emotion, disgust, anger, and pride, you can have like a modeling/modifying conflict where you're trying to define what the thing is by thinking about it, but then you're also trying to change it. So with a relation, you're like thinking of an idea, and then pride is also trying to change it. So it's like that aha moment. It's really hard to achieve. A lot of people don't think of it as an emotion, but that's just because it's very complicated and it's very rationalizing and narrativizing, or you could think of it as systematizing.
I mean, fear and pride are 2 things I probably wouldn't want on my tombstone, although I don't think that they're inaccurate at the same time. And
hold on. It's a fantastic archetype, and especially your 2 archetypes are the top 2 easily for giving feedback on the test. The scientist is always picking apart the questions and being like, well, this could be this and this, and talking about gray zones and all these like the buffers and stuff. And the architect just gives great overall feedback, especially on the result page. Like I recently redid the whole results page and basically threw all my book content onto the results page. That was all at the suggestion of an architect. So I'm glad to hear your feedback, Charlotte, because it'll be a good follow up to that.
Well, I'm really intrigued. I mean, I generally, when people are like, what do you do? Right? You meet somebody for the first time. I generally say I'm an artist. But I'm looking forward to trying on architect, although I think people might misunderstand that one a little bit. They might think I build skyscrapers or something.
Yeah. I recently tested a guy that was an architect, and he did not get the architect. That was his result.
He was a bureaucrat. Is that an archetype? That's not an archetype, though. Yeah, maybe we can, really quick, since we're talking about all these archetypes, down at the bottom here, it has all the different archetypes. I wanted to just tell people about those, maybe. So we have the artist, which is, what do you call this, their primary motion combination? The descriptor below it?
Characteristic motion.
One more time?
Characteristic motion. Characteristic motion.
Okay, so the artist characteristic is attachment. Then we have the dragon slayer, which is duress. The wizard, remorse. The defender, satisfaction. The fixer, envy. The giver, devotion. The scientist, anxiety.
Checks out.
The hero, frustration. And of course, the architect, revelation. And yeah, I just think I'm just really hung up on this idea that this is very much a shadow self-examination process for me, right? Because like I said, I wouldn't really want fear and pride written on my tombstone, although they're not necessarily inaccurate. And there's the reality of ourselves, and then there's the self that we try to project, which of course we're trying to cover up our fear and pride or whatever it is as much as possible. I feel like, that's our quest. And would you say that that's our quest, is to overcome those emotions?
A lot of people ask me about this, and I think it's just the classic like breadth versus depth argument, where you kind of have to decide whether you want to be well-rounded or whether you want to kind of double down on your strengths and weaknesses. And I think it depends on your situation, what you're specialized in. If you're doing something like becoming a parent, you might want to be more well-rounded.
But these are both weaknesses, are they not?
Fear and pride?
Yeah. I would describe them as... I would describe revelation as a great characteristic. Like,
well, so this is what's interesting, is that the revelation is the emotion, but as far as I can tell, so you have this, when you give the results, and this is something that I'm trying to understand. So you're like, okay, so emotions are felt in beats, with each argument being voiced in each beat. And so you have this chart of the various emotions. And so it's satisfaction, revelation, frustration, contempt, remorse, duress, zeal, devotion, hatred, envy, anxiety, and attachment. And what you've done is you make the case that each one of these emotions is built out of the arguments within it.
Yep.
And so for the architect, whose primary sensation is revelation, the way that you chart it out is that you build it out of fear, guilt, disgust, anger, and pride. But then later on in the page, you're like, but somebody whose primary emotion is revelation might not actually experience on the surface level those like basic building blocks, those arguments. Like the revelation somehow takes them and transmutes them into something that is unrecognizable and can only really be analytically taken apart.
I would say it's more like a need, like an itch that gets scratched. So the process, I call it abbreviation. So when the emotional bar skips over emotions like that, the emotions that get skipped over are abbreviated. I would say that they're satisfied, but not overtly felt. But you could also describe the entire bar itself as a combination of all those underlying emotions. The most obvious two are the starting emotion and ending emotion. But it's like a scale that you go through in a beat. It's like a brush stroke. It's not like two dots.
Mm-hmm.
At least as far as I can tell.
Interesting.
Right. So what is the positive? What is the upshot of fear and pride governing my emotional inner landscape?
Okay, so if you think of fear as not like, oh, there's a bear, I'm going to run away. That's like the highest form of fear. Instead, think of what's happening in your brain when you do see a bear and think, oh, well, he's bigger than me. You're making a size comparison. You're doing spatial skills stuff. You're building a model of the environment. You need to know which way to run through. All of that stuff is governed by fear and anger. So the fear part of it is just the rational thinking part. It's the look part. The anger part of it is I don't want to say irrational. It's hyper-rational like all the rest. But the anger is the modified part. It wants to modify the world. It wants to change the world. Whether that means disgust and anger, which would be like a hatred response or a fight response, or a zeal response, which is anger to pride, which would be radical anger. Or changing the subject, if you want to do the human discourse translation.
So why fear as opposed to curiosity or something like that, or desire to know, something like that?
I like fear. I like the visceral names for the base emotions. I think if you think of them as concentrations, like very concentrated liquids that you're mixing together to make like a more blended and even final result, it makes more sense. But fear, the fear that you're talking about, where it's curiosity, where it's I'm going to sit down with a book, I'm going to know this thing back and forth. I'm going to be involved at work. I'm going to build a work world in my head and operate within that. And the emotion that you're talking about when it's like negative, like, oh, I don't want to be characterized by fear. But they're the same emotion, like straight up. And that's the best way to describe heuristics, I think, at least the building blocks of heuristics, is that those two things are the same thing. And one is very low level. It's very comfortable. It's taking a quick drag of fear. And one is like IV injection of fear. It's like really intense. But it's the same basic underlying drug, the same underlying mechanic.
The same motivational juice.
Yeah, it's the same. So I call them arguments. So you should think of fear and anger as the same argument and the same emotion. It's the same juice, as you call it. It's just a different flavor or different. Like if you think of a coin, you can only see one side of the coin, but the coin is this actual underlying thing. And I call that the world argument, and it's shaped by natural selection. If you want to take an evolutionary take on it, which I do, it's shaped by basically surviving the physical natural environment.
Yeah, what's really interesting about humans, and I wonder if this is true about other social organisms in general, is that we take on these roles, right? And I think this is, in some sense, the archetype argument. Does this go back to Carl Jung, essentially? This idea.
I love Jung.
Yeah.
I'm probably less familiar with his work than I should be, but I definitely consider him an inspiration.
It will arouse fear in you to read Jung. It's very, very difficult. He writes. He's kind of like Chomsky. It's just these ideas just rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling and rolling, and very little chewing it up for you before.
Very little hand-holding.
Yes, very little hand-holding.
That's great. Philosophy is really hard to write. I've noticed how it's kind of just categorically been unlike anything else I've written, and I don't really know what it should be still. The book I've kind of been using as like a cache of knowledge. So it's like a repository where I keep track of stuff. It feels a little bit like a textbook. at times. I don't know how I should bring the message of like emotions or arguments to people. If it should be like snappy and funny and like philosophical, and have like philosophical like stories and stuff on it. Philosophy is hard. It's hard to write.
So maybe we can zoom out a little bit and then come back to the specifics of the test and start with the question of what motivated you to put together a personality test in the first place.
That's a good question. I felt like there wasn't a good rhetorical one out there, like one that made like a philosophical, like rhetorical argument for what everything was. And I guess I wanted to start with that as a base. I wanted something that didn't discuss, at least overtly, stuff like neurotransmitters, medications. Like I wanted something unclinical, untraditional, and basically something detached from institutions in general. So it kind of basically had to be a simple vocabulary and a simple set of rules that describe how emotions work. I wanted something like that to exist because I felt like, don't get me wrong, like life's a journey for everyone, but sometimes people want to learn the violin and get really good at the violin. You know, they don't want to go on an emotional like trip, you know, there and back and have all these revelations of self and all that stuff. Sometimes people just want an explanation and they understand how stuff works and they can notice when that thing's happening and then do this opposite thing, which kind of addresses it and says it out. I felt like there was no mechanical understanding like what an emotion was, or even description. So it was basically at one level you had the studies, which were too broad, and it's like, oh well, 1,000 people, you know, have had this problem, and then we described this set of behaviors as this, and then this medicine might do this or that. Instead, I wanted something that tracked earlier on where the emotions started spinning out. I mean, a lot of my stuff is based on like an addiction model.
Sorry, say that again?
An addiction model.
Okay, can you explain
so
that?
Like emotions are addictive. So basically, Shiloh, when you feel revelation, that aha moment, that's hard earned. That's a hard emotion to satisfy. So you get that dose of, let's call it rewards. We don't need to say which neurotransmitter it is. It's not really important. It feels good. You feel successful. You feel prideful. You feel intellectually satisfied. When that happens, you want to keep feeling that way, but it's a dose of effectively a drug, and it wears off over time. And then you have to go for another revelation reward. But just like a drug, you build a tolerance. You seek more and more of it to get the same high from it. So it can kind of become this thing where you chase revelation, you become addicted to it. And someone who is addicted to revelation would show aspects of depression, anxiety, and also like mania, maybe, and also Machiavellianism, if they were, if they lean that direction.
How's that feed in?
So that's what the underlying.
He's concerned.
I didn't know that.
I mean, like he's definitely Machiavellian.
Really?
Oh my god, yeah.
Good Lord. Man alive. This is I had no idea this was gonna be a Shiloh on the couch podcast. I'm cool with it though. Let's figure out what's wrong with me. I don't know. It's not what's
You're
wrong
always
with me,
like
right?
10 steps deep in figuring out exactly the way that something should go down in order to get the achieved desire. Shiloh has this entire model of like putting handles on things in order to be able to manipulate them into the right position. And at some point I was like, I caught him in trying to put handles on me so he could get me to do the things that he wanted.
Right.
It's just like, dude, you can put handles on everybody else.
I got that from George Washington, actually.
I don't.
Always grasp things by the smooth handle. It's a quote, I believe.
Interesting.
Yeah. Usually it's healthy. Usually, emotions are in balance and we're getting the right amount. We're not like. So, I mean, if you think of the hours of the day, you could divide them into 6, and that's how much time we should be spending feeling each of the 6 base emotions. So, I mean, if you look at it as like a time of day thing, if you're only like let's say 18 hours a day, then that means 3 hours per emotion. So if you're feeling Machiavellian 3 hours a day, that's actually healthy as long as you're not also still splurging on pride in the other parts of the day. Um,
So
but
there's a goal of balance here. Then it seems like.
yeah, like so the addictions to the emotions of disgust, anger, and pride are known in the clinical circles as the dark triad, which is narcissism, psychopathy, and machiavellianism. If you have one of those emotions in your result in the second slot, you're going to kind of lean towards one of those three in certain terms. And yeah, it's all about finding a balance and managing it with what I call virtues, which is kind of like feeling the opposite emotion of love, fear, or guilt. So if you do feel Machiavellian, you can just think, well, how can I put this thing towards helping the community and not just advancing my spot within the community?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily about advancing my spot. We didn't really define Machiavellianism.
And I don't think that you have the like traditional dark triad version of it. I think that you're just very keenly aware of like the games that people
Efficiency,
play.
organizing.
And just the games that people play. I think that we've talked a lot about this idea of like life is a game, right? And if life is a game, then
everything's a game. I mean, this podcast is a game. We're all just playing a game here. Like, it's fun.
Yeah.
I really love doing it. You know, I love all the games that I play. Music's a game. Life's a game.
So that's low level, right? That everything's a game is low level Machiavellianism. The high level the high level Machiavellians would say that there's one game. You know, they wouldn't say everything's a game. They'd say there's one game and I'm playing that game.
I see.
And for some of them, it's going to be image or power or whatever it is, but they're going to see one game and play that.
I mean, for me, it's largely a healing game in some sense, right? I just feel like life is packed with trauma. Our own death is quite traumatic by itself, that it's always looming over us since day one. And I feel like all these games, in some sense, are attempts to heal from that primordial trauma. That's the way I look at it, anyways.
No, I think that fits any fear dominant archetype for sure. And the three of us are actually the three fear dominant archetypes. So you have the scientist, the architect, and the dragon slayer. I'm the dragon slayer. Yes, I gave it a cool name because it's my archetype.
Hell yeah, I would too.
And well, so I mean, a lot of the time, people talk to me about the test, and they're like, "Hey, I had this response to the test," and I try to explain to them. I did too. Like, I took the test and got, "Oh, you're characterized by fear and disgust," and I'm like, "Well, that's awful. That's terrible. Those are the two worst words." And I thought about it from the same lens as you were saying, Shallow, where maybe I should change these to be softer and to be better and nicer. But I didn't. I think they need to be mean. I think they are mean. I think emotions are. I mean, everyone kind of recognizes that emotions are like the animalistic, baser parts of ourselves, like overwhelming others. But you could think of the three arguments or the three jurors in your head as, like I said, being amoral. I don't want to say they're all psychopaths, but one's a psychopath, one's a Machiavellian, and one's a narcissist, effectively.
And you think that's universal? Or you think that that's specifically for given archetypes?
So, it's definitely not universal. Like, everyone can feel every emotion. Some people have, like, weaker dualities, sometimes significant so. But I think, no, everyone can feel every emotion. I think some archetypes are more given to addictions, and you can be addicted to love, fear, and guilt as well. And those are oftentimes just as bad and just as draining on their loved ones. So, no, I wouldn't. I mean, addiction is definitely a bad thing. And disorders that are associated with those addictions are definitely bad things, or at least they're hard to get through for people near you, and also for yourself. Yeah, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but
hey, real quick, can we define emotion? I don't know if we did that already, but is emotion this argument in your book?
Yeah. So you can kind of use emotion to describe those 6 base emotions that we discussed. But I think it would be So there's actually three levels. There's also the characteristic emotions, which we described. Anastasia, you went through I think there's 21 of them. There's also fleeting emotions, which I kind of just recently took out of the test. They're a little bit more confusing, but stuff like joy and exhilaration, where a lot of people would consider those real emotions. Like that's what a real feeling is, because what comes to you and happens to you is really severe, and then it goes away real fast. But really, it's for all emotions, the characteristic emotions, the fleeting emotions, and the base emotions. They're just the way they combine is as described by Eristics.
So this is a pretty radical perspective, because I think the way emotions are traditionally defined is something akin to the motivators. Like if we look at the etymology of the word emotion, it's something about moving you, right? Moving you away from where you were, something like that.
Yeah.
But I guess that's not out of line, because an argument also moves you in some direction as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say it fits. And that's kind of how I designed Eristics. I mean, if you talk about Eristics from an evolutionary standpoint, you can make sense of it with the term. So if you talk about it from like a philosophical standpoint, like a literal rhetorical argument standpoint, it makes sense with the terms. I designed it to kind of be like an ingestible philosophical base for talking about.
That word you just used, Eristic, I've never heard that before. Argument, right? Something like that?
So if you look at the word, it means given to argument. Like an Eristic is someone who is given to argument. I did kind of co-opt it, and I'm also kind of honoring the traditional meaning. But yeah, the three arguments inside your head, the argument of the self, the argument of the world, and the argument of society, they are Eristics. They are three entities that are given to argument. They need to present their argument in their arena.
Self, world, and society. How does the world differ from society?
So the world is like the physical environment, the real world, the physical concrete world.
Gotcha.
Society
Physical
is more
universe.
like the social structure layer that we've inserted up in everything. Like you have a model of society in your head that doesn't actually exist, but you live within that.
You drive on the right side of the road.
Right. I hope. That's one I don't want to wake up forgetting.
And so you make this case that these emotions are arguments for survival in the three arenas of self, world, and society.
Right.
How did you come up with that framework?
I would say a lot of it is inspired by evolution. I had mentioned before the link between fear and anger, the fear and anger duality, and natural selection. There's just as strong of a connection between love, disgust, the duality of the self, and sexual selection. And then the third one is just artificial selection. That's selection by society, basically how we're shaped by each other, or what we have in our long tribal past.
And so basically, you're making a model where the emotions are the tools that are kind of inborn and innate in the way that we relate to these three domains, and the importance of these three domains to the way that we organize our own lives and our own actions.
Yeah. And when you say domains, I can tell that you're taking a pretty broad, zoomed out look at it. But I would describe it as fractal, or if you zoom in, it's still the same pattern. Like the underlying Eristic beat pattern is on the order of milliseconds, I'd say.
Interesting. And so like in each interaction, there is all three of these that are impinging upon that interaction.
I know. Yeah, so my system focuses on like the two loudest, or the two basically that have achieved a majority, and the majority is the resulting emotion. So for Shiloh, his fear and pride arguments win often. So when they win the arguments, that's the resulting emotion. And if that's how it works. It's like the decision process between these three, as you call them, domains, which I think is a good way to look at it. And how it's systematized on a low level, I'll leave it to the scientists. But
wait, what is it that I feel when I win the arguments against those things?
So are you talking about the inverted emotion?
I don't know. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with your
Oh,
terminology here.
This
no
is what's
worries.
so interesting about this is that it's a way of talking about emotions that I've never seen before, and it's like I can see that there's something here, but I'm still trying to piece together how to put it into my own words. And so so what you're saying is that the fear and the pride is what is primarily felt as the argument in some situation.
Yeah, by default, that's kind of like Shiloh's go-to
And the results
as the
ideally is
archetype.
revelation
Or the experience is
I
revelation.
or the
think
experience.
for you, that's the one you're best at. Yeah. If you think of the 6 base emotions as like well-worn grooves, those would be your most well-worn grooves.
And
Yeah.
then on a good day, they result in revelation. Is that the way to think about it?
On the good day, your revelation is productive is a good way to think about it.
I see. It's not paranoid and all over the place.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Or misdirected. Like if you spend all day playing a video game, I mean, don't get me wrong, video games are awesome, recreation is important. But you could argue that your hard-won revelations during that game didn't actually accomplish anything real good.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. We've had a lot of conversations about psychedelics lately, and there's almost a universal sense of revelation from people taking these mystic voyages, but the ability to bring it back to reality seems to be really, really difficult for people to actually make that a meaningful. I mean, it's not the same for all psychedelics, but the ones that I grew up around, like acid or mushrooms, something like that, they seem like people would have these experiences and they couldn't communicate their findings to other people very well or really bring them back to reality. And I think people who have the more intense DMT experiences, the things where they travel to the jungle and do these ayahuasca ceremonies, they do have revelations that change them maybe more often. But that idea of the unproductive revelation. Oh, dreams are a great example, by the way, too.
Mhm.
That's a really funny one. That's a really common one for me is I'll have this dream where I'm like, I figured it out. And then I wake up and I'm like, oh, what was it I figured out? And it's a horrible, horrible feeling, actually.
That's cool. Yeah, dreams are kind of the domain of the guilt and pride duality, the society duality. And sometimes I call the other two the waking dualities. But yeah, guilt and pride is actually active when we sleep. Which, if you think about it, makes sense because we sleep 1/3 of the day. It's 3 emotions, so it's 1/3 of the emotions we're feeling. But yeah, it's kind of like guilt and pride weaves everything together when we sleep. And I imagine the emotions used in most is probably revelation. So dreams are probably interesting to the architect.
It's interesting. So the role of dreams or the role of sleep in some sense is weaving together. It's one of our friends pointed out the other day that when you're encountering a lot of novelty, you tend to need more sleep, right? So, and I've seen this to play out in my own life. I'm doing, a podcast, and then I'm going and working on a record, and then I have some meetings with new guests, and I'm all over the place. I need a nap after that really badly. But if I'm just doing computer work all day, various emailing and stuff, I might be kind of worn out still, but I don't feel the need for sleep as much, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I wonder if that's like a context switching overhead thing. Like, I wonder what the actual underlying cause is there.
It's just something about all that stimuli. It's just so very diverse, especially it's like this job we have, which is so cool. We get to talk to all these really fascinating people, but they're so different. And I feel like integrating all that is really difficult on the fly, and fitting people's ideas into slots in your brain is really hard because I feel it as soon as I go lie down after doing a bunch of that. I kind of like feel this replay of like things it almost feels like they're just getting like defragged and put into the right place. And then I kind of eventually black out for a few minutes and then I wake up and I'm like good to go after that. It's a really strange, profound experience that I've been feeling lately.
I feel like everyone's a little bit overwhelmed. Like we all are bombarded with all these different ideas and sensations and experiences. And I think we're not really honest with ourselves about like how much it affects us. But I've definitely noticed the parody you described where there's like if you have 3 good REM sessions when you sleep, which is roughly like 90-minute periods, you can have like 3 like creative sessions the next day. Like they map to each other real quick.
Whoa.
That's really interesting.
At least that's my theory. It's not really Eristics related, but that's what I do.
That's interesting. Do you use like a sleep tracker or something to see how many REM cycles you have?
Oh no,
You're just counting.
I can tell. I can tell by the time it took this and how well rested I feel. I mean, the options are 2, 3, or 4. And you're familiar with 2 and 3 because that's what happens the most often. And 4 is like, wow, I got too much sleep.
Yeah, there's sometimes this decision point in the morning where you're like, I could do another one, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes like the sun comes up, especially in the summer. It's like sun comes up really early. I'm like, I could get up and go for a run and get on with my day. But sometimes I just feel that need to, or I have the opportunity, actually more often than not. It's like, I don't have anything scheduled at 10, so I could, push this morning back a little bit. And it's interesting how it doesn't always account to too much sleep. Sometimes I feel like you really need that extra one. But yeah, God, I love the sleep world. It just baffles me endlessly.
Well, it's also a missing world, right? Because there's something that's happening that doesn't come up to the surface. It's really hard for me to remember my dreams. And I've noticed that caffeine really discourages the recall of dreams. And I think I'm still experiencing them. It's completely wiped clean almost the moment that I wake up. And so I find that when I do remember them, there's always this process of in the morning just thinking about what happened and trying to piece together what the symbolism is. Like I had this crazy dream the other day where I was at my parents' house and there was this gigantic golden panther that was terrorizing the neighborhood. And it was like up on the roof of the house that's across the street, and it's nighttime and there's people on the street and everybody's screaming and it's like jumping from roof to roof and you can only see the vague outline of it. And somehow there's this like team of street urchins that I join and we like manage to corral this giant beast. And I just have this really visceral memory of its face cradled in my hands before it runs off into the night. I'm like, what does that mean? Been haunted by it for the last week and I have no idea.
I don't know. I don't do a lot of dream stuff.
I know, right?
I want to write about it now because I want to figure out the golden jaguar meaning. But to me, I would just say that it's your world and society systems playing this inside your head and practicing and just getting what we think of as exercise.
So we have these 3 arenas of survival: self, world, and society. And then you also give what's called the Eristic order, which is the you say it's the order of an archetype's emotional arguments.
I know.
And so
there's always a self, world, and society argument, but the order and expression differs between archetypes.
So a good example is your 2 archetypes, the scientists and the architects, both have the same Eristic order. They both have an order of 2, 3, 1. So the world argument comes first, then society argument. Those are the 2 most complex arguments. So those 2 archetypes will both be like systems or the complexity. So the third argument is the self argument, and there's like a whole scale of how weak or strong that is in those 2 archetypes. But the like stereotypical like weak sense of self can map to like a particular set of like quote unquote nerdy or geeky interests where you kind of lose yourself and you're thinking about the system and society and stuff it's presented to.
This is the dirtbag archetype.
yeah.
This is the failure to wear the black tie to the black tie dinner.
I would say it's the opposite. I would feel like your 2 archetypes are not the most connected to society, but having that society argument right there in the second spot puts you behind only 2 other arguments or 2 other archetypes as far as like getting along in society and being a part of society.
I mean, I think that this is what this project is very much. It's like oriented towards society. And so it's hard to say that we're not at least trying to influence it on some deep level. But I'm trying to understand, so you give the Eristic order and you say it describes the usual order of an archetype's emotional arguments. What is it about the order that describes the order of emotional arguments? Because these are arenas of survival. So how do the arenas of survival influence the order of emotional arguments?
Context, mostly.
Okay.
If you're talking to a family member or loved one, it's loving, discuss, direct by. If you're trudging through the woods and you're trying to find your trail, fear and anger will be at play. If you're trying to coordinate with your group to get everyone to meet back at the meeting point at the right time, guilt and pride will be at play. And they'll combine with the appropriate other emotions to basically get the job done. The job is roughly energy allocation, and I was recently taken to describing emotions as like energy candidates, where you're basically spending energy to get more energy. And the different emotions are just basically audience to do that.
And so, let's see, we've covered fear. We haven't really talked too much about guilt. And so with the scientist, the first argument is fear and the second argument is guilt. So let's talk about the interplay of those two.
Okay, so they're both internalizing or modeling, and they're both focused on either the world or society. So you're all about modeling. The basic heuristic story, if you will, is that you model the world and then you bring it to your society. Bring your model back to society. That's what the scientist does. They tell it. That is their sense of self. And again, their sense of self, if that makes sense.
Sorry, their
That's
sense
like
of self
is fear, guilt. Like that's their characteristic notion. So they come back to that, but it's not the self argument. It's the other two arguments. That's kind of what characterizes your three. The wizard's also in your food of having the third place self argument.
And so because when you lay out the results of this, you lay out the way that these things relate to the like first two arenas, but you don't lay out the way that it relates to the third arena. Is that because it's just like too far in the back to warrant real consideration? Like, what does it mean to not have the self as an arena in the Eristic order, or have it to be in the third position?
It is there. It's less important just because of the majority rules type of thing. So to simplify the system, I don't consider it. But there is an implied love or disgust argument also happening in every Eristic beat after the two that I present. But I would best describe it as like the framework or groundwork of the argument that's happening, more than it's actually an active voice in the argument. It's kind of a fuzzy concept because, like you said, it kind of disappears back there in third place. But yeah, I have measurably noticed a difference between the scientists that get fear, guilt, love, and the scientists that get fear, guilt, disgust. And if I expanded the test at all, I would include that as one of the next archetypes. It would be like disgust characterized some-based. I forget what I used to call it.
What are the differences that you find where it's fear, guilt, and love versus fear, guilt, and disgust?
I get along with the fear, guilt, disgust people a lot better. Straight up. The way that love and disgust shape our like conception of the world is really hard to shift and change. So having someone else that has like the disgust perspective, which is basically like, I don't use the word negative because it makes it seem like negative, but like subtractive would be a better word, where you're taking away to get an understanding rather than you building, which is what love does. So if I meet a scientist that's like quickly dismissive and incisive and witty, and we always get on.
And so
the scientists that are good.
No, yes, you were going to give the other example.
Oh, yeah. So the scientists that are characterized more by love are usually more open to answers, but there's also this foreverness where you can't actually change their mind because they just remain open. They don't actually ever switch over to become Riepe Bayesian. I feel like that's my frustration with the fear, guilt, love archetype, if that is a subtype of the scientist. I think scientists need to use more disgust.
Like that. Well, it's interesting to describe it as disgust because I wonder, I can't find it in this page, but I feel like I saw it in an earlier version of this where it's like disgust is this external, because it's the external argument, right? It's oriented outwards rather than inwards. And so it's this desire to change. It's the desire to change the world from what it is already.
It's the desire to change the self. The self.
The self.
If that makes sense. The self of the self. The love, disgust, duality, that self. The self that's actually your literal physical self, but also the extended self that we talked about. Like that's what you consider like, I say self, but it's like your real actual self. But
you're like almost trying to decontaminate yourself.
What do you mean?
It seems like disgust is like an act of decontamination in some sense.
It is, absolutely. Yeah, I would say it governs cleaning. Really, it covers modifying myself. So stuff like getting tattoos, basic stuff like grooming, I would say is governed by disgust. Even simple stuff like hygiene. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. You can, if you want the softball version of the word, it would be discernment.
Why don't you use the softball versions of all of these things?
I like the hardball versions.
You like the shadow.
It would be hard, yeah. It's very much a duress thing. Like I'm characterized by duress, and that what seems appropriate is the strong version of emotion. Because that's the one that you're going to know instantly and widely in the right way. So you might be more emotionally nuanced, but I'm trying to go for a wider system that covers everyone. And that once they fearing, that's include running away from the tiger.
Yeah. So can we talk about how the utility of this system is? This something that you imagine one could go to when trying to assemble a dream team of people? Is it good to have the full spread covered in a group that's trying to succeed in an evolutionary sense, in whether it's business or any project? Or
I think so, absolutely. You want to cover all six bases, but at the same time, you also want to honor, like, not covering certain bases, depending on your work culture. There are a lot of corporate overreaches in the sense of self, like, oh, we're a family here. It's like that might not actually be appropriate. So, I mean, you definitely want to get more fear and anger at work and more guilt and pride at work. I'm working with a potential client now on making a test that covers those two for the workplace. So I'd say yes. If you're working on a project and everyone's there and they're doing it all the time, cover all six bases. But if they're going home to their families, honor some of the well and discussed.
Is there an archetype that you think is the least desirable archetype?
No, not at all. I've come to appreciate the perspective of all the archetypes. I would say if I had to pick one to answer that question, it would be the Dragon Slayer. They basically they're weak at guilt, and that can kind of be a useful emotion for plugging into society. There's this thing that people do where they kind of just by default adopt the viewpoint and perspective of their surrounding society and use that as the starting point and then build their belief set from there. I mean, Dragon Slayer doesn't do that at all. The Dragon Slayer just puts everything together in their own system, and basically who they are and how they behave depends on the quality of their own system, so that you just get this wide array of individuals, some of which can plug into society and play along, and some of which just cannot. But basically, if you think of fear dominance as like something caused by trauma at a certain childhood, it basically tells your emotional system that, hey, the most important argument isn't the self argument, the family stuff. It's not the society argument and running for office and, doing stuff with systems and all that. It's actually the world argument. It's the argument of the world. Because there is a danger present in the environment, and you do need to use fear and anger to survive, and you need to use those two the most. So if you learn that lesson, so to speak, when you're between the ages of 2 and 12, you'll have what I call a fear dominant personality, which embodies the three of our archetypes. So once you become fear dominant, there's basically 3 emotions you can go to after that. You can't go to love because love's lower energy. That would be attachment. It needs to start with fear. But it's definitely like the left to right thing if you're leading the graphs in the system. You can go to guilt. That's the lowest energy, easiest option. All that emotions, anxiety. You can go to disgust. That's a little bit higher energy. It has one externalizing emotion. That's duress. That's the option I take. And then you can go from fear all the way to pride. That's the biggest leap, hardest one to accomplish. But arguably it has the best reward. Shiloh, that's kind of like your strategy. But all 3 of them, the difference between your 2 archetypes and mine is that with your 2 archetypes, that society argument's in there, and my archetype, it's not. So Dragon Slayers often just have a really tough time connecting to a group, and they always feel kind of an ambassador for ourselves when we're among a group. You probably know someone like this. We tend to be the one-knowns and kind of drift away. But that's kind of that's how fear works, right? Because if you're running on the world argument, you just see the outside world as like dangerous. All 3 of us would see that.
What about in terms of like pairing up? So romantic partners, spouses, things like that. Is there any kind of yin yang to this? Like, could I predict what sort of partner personality type would complement mine?
You could. I think it's more productive to again think of the breadth versus depth argument, where as a couple, do we really want to double down in this 2-3-1 Eristic order and be really analytical and just have that as like sort of like superpower between 2 people? Or do we want to supplement each other? Instead of doing analysis stuff, I'll do more of the self stuff. We'll have more of the bases covered, so to speak. It's kind of a decision that has like twice the consequences because there's like a multiplying effect. But I would say in general, cover all your bases just as an individual. Because when you don't have your bases covered and you start building up like a need for a certain emotion, that's when you start getting like the addictive behavior. So if you haven't had like any sort of satisfaction with the love and disgust based arguments, which is like basically sense of self stuff, you'll build up a need for it, and then when you go after that need, it'll usually be an unproductive, like unhealthy behavior. So the clinical system would call love addiction codependency. So in this situation, if you let the love need build up, and your pet's not around, your partner's off, and it's just like you're going to start acting codependent after a while of that, just because the love need builds up. And then when you go to satisfy that codependency, you'll build unhealthy habits, right? And that's sort of how the ball gets rolling. What I would call love addiction, which is really an addiction to all of the emotions that love is into. So attachment's kind of the easy go-to example if you're talking about codependence. But a person like that is going to be addicted to that love-fear combo and that reward system.
What does it look like for somebody to have a sense of self as the first argument?
I think we would call them the normal people.
What is that like?
Yeah, I know. I wish I knew. I think they're less prone to like the fight or flight anxious mode that we tend to exist in. I think a lot of it for them depends on the second argument. Like there's a really wide range of differences in the love dominant archetypes. Like doing love fear and doing love anger are two very different emotional experiences. Attachment and frustration. Yeah, I don't know. Self-assured, I guess. Mostly.
Interesting. So,
Yeah.
the love pride dimension is the one that seems like the most bubblegum one. You describe it as satisfaction.
Mhm.
And so, what is the archetype where the love pride axis is the dominant one?
That's called the defender.
The defender.
Yeah.
But the defender is. What did I see? Oh, satisfaction. Okay. Yeah, that makes
Okay.
sense.
Is there a normal distribution of these? You mentioned the normal. Is there one that pops up more than others?
Oh, yeah, you must have a bunch of back-end data on this.
I have no data. I try not to gather any, just as a matter of principle. But also because it would all be useless data, because there's so many different selection bias gates that are happening. Like if there's one archetype that doesn't like taking personality tests, for example, that pollutes my data forever. And the only way to actually fight against that and know anything, instead of just being like, oh, a quarter of people are scientists. It's like, no, a quarter of people aren't scientists, but scientists are more likely to click on this test and be like, hey, here's a system I can analyze and see if it's yes, I can see if it halts up, I can see if I can scrutinize it. So it might just be more appealing to them. But yeah, it was obvious to me early on that data in particular just wouldn't ever be reliable. I still don't even have basic analytics on the thing, but it's a next step for sure.
You'd have to kidnap a room of people at random and lock them to the chain them to their chairs or something. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to control it for their randomness.
How many people have taken the test? Do you know?
I mean, it's got to be thousands by now. Oh yeah, 1,000. I've personally administered the tests probably around 200 times now. And that started out of a notebook where I actually like tallied it up by hand. And now it's just made it in a film.
So the test itself is really short. It's what, like 15, 16 questions?
16, yeah.
How did you settle on the questions?
So I have this concept with these questions of doing work. And you want the question to do work. And the work is basically making people pick between the dualities. So basically every question will set you up to see if you lean more towards fear versus anger, whether you lean more towards the fear-anger duality versus the guilt-pride duality. And it's basically giving all of the base emotions. It's giving all of them the same point pool to pull from. So there's the same potential for points. And then every time you do answer a question, this is why skipping is also effective and gives me information. Every time you do answer a question, you basically throw points into the pool, and then it looks like which point tool is higher, and you characterize it from there.
Does skipping throw points at something?
So skipping is interesting because it doesn't throw any points at anything, but it also foregoes all of the points involved in that question. So if you skip something that is asking you about the self-duality and the world duality, and you forego all of those, then you do kind of bias the rest of the results towards the society duality.
Interesting, because when I was taking it, I was thinking, some of these are really hard to answer. You know, I could almost go either way. But I figured if I skipped it, then I would be feeding less information into the algorithm. So I kind of forced myself to go with.
You understand the concept of doing work. Yeah, that's the work, for sure.
Were you surprised that having such a narrow list of questions was able to give what a lot of people seem to feel is a really accurate perspective on their internal order?
Yes. So I I used to have a more hacked together version of the test. And what it would do is it would actually grade the test every time you interacted with the test. So as people took it, I could see what their result was as they were taking it. And it used to have 25 questions. And I noticed that in the last 10 questions, it often wouldn't change at all. And they had like basically fallen into, I don't know how you describe the topography, but it would be like a hill or a valley. And they were kind of destined to be that archetype, even if they started winning a bunch of points in some particular category, it wouldn't be enough. So I noticed that happened in question 16 or so. So I cut it down to 16. Might bump it up to 20, just to give people more of a feeling of it being enough. But 16 is enough. If I did bump it up to 20, it would just be a reassurance thing.
I love it. So, go ahead. No, go.
I was going to say, just following up on my question about the pairing of people, in terms of whether you perceive yourselves as complementary or whether you perceive yourselves as mortal enemies, what's the defining hinge there? Because you could see somebody who's completely opposite you and be like, okay, we could work together because they do the opposite of me. And the same could be said, I guess, about somebody who's the exact same as you, right?
Yeah.
What is it that orients us towards one or the other?
So you do see this in the test results. So like your archetype, for example, is characterized by revelation, which is a combination of fear and pride. If you flip both of those into their other forms, you get anger and guilt. And the actual form of that would be guilt and anger. That archetype is called the wizard. So if you met a wizard, you both are similar in a lot of ways because you have that sense of self argument, but you're going to be different in your approach to almost everything because they're going to tend towards guilt approaches, which is like, let's all work together, let's be equivalent, and anger approaches, which is let's just get in there and do it. Like let's stop looking and leap is a good way to think of anger. Whereas your approach is going to be the opposite. You're going to use fear instead of anger, and you're going to use pride instead. So it'll be like all about rationality and narrativizing and like using that huge analytic thing to achieve revolution.
Interesting. So I got to watch out for wizards out there.
Yeah.
In general, that's good advice.
I mean, they can supplement you, but they can also magnify your shared weakness. Like if you both have a weak sense of self, it'll be hard to get along. And just in general. But yeah, I think you would tend to be enemies. Be one friends.
What do you think is the utility of this sort of emotional diagramming? Like, what does it do for people?
It helps people understand what's going on with their own emotional system. I feel like a lot of the benefit of the test is just one confirmation. Like, yes, people think this way, people have this emotional approach. I definitely felt that when I took the test. I felt like, okay, it makes sense. And then, like, when I test people and they do get the same results as me, I can talk to them. We do have, like, a similar outlook on things. I feel like the utility is mostly that understanding and that feeling of belonging that it can provide. Past that, yeah, there's mechanical stuff. Yeah, if I'm feeling a lot of anger, I can obviously feel fear that try and combat it because you can't feel fear and anger at the same time or the same argument. And it's like trying to feel tails and heads at the same time. You just can't do it. So I think we can use that duality in the system, to everyone in the system, to kind of diagnose what's going on and also give a direction on where to go. I shouldn't use the word diagnose, but to understand what's going on. Because it's not a clinical process, it's not.
Yeah, to what extent are these personalities malleable? I mean, several years ago we did some sort of ocean test. I remember learning that I was an extremely disagreeable person, which of course was surprising to me because I thought I was pretty chill. But in the years since, I've often found myself trying to be less disagreeable as a result of having taken that test. And
I think you succeeded.
Yeah, maybe, right? So the personality seems plastic to some extent, and it can be
Yeah,
guided by our intentions.
yeah. I described these 6 base emotions as being those 6 grooves, and they're more or less one. The test describes like how they are relative to each other, but it doesn't describe like the true depth of how one. Like you can be really into like love and anger, and you can feel a whole lot of frustration that might involve rumination towards loved ones, or yelling at loved ones, or um, basically anger addiction symptoms.
Hmm.
Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it just feels like it would be interesting to see the test give some feedback on the pieces that are missing. Not necessarily in like a diagnostic sense, but in the sense
And
of, okay, so these are the dimensions in which you operate. Where for the scientist, it's anxiety. Honestly, it seems like anxiety is the like primary. Oh, I guess the second argument is guilt. Okay, so it's like fear and guilt are the two strongest, which sum to produce anxiety. And then zeal is kind of the backside of that coin. Is that accurate?
yeah,
And so you said something really interesting, which is that if you were feeling some emotion, that there is this other side of the coin that you can turn towards in order to curtail it. And so having some aspect of that in the test would be really interesting to say that, like, okay, so if you're overwhelmed by these emotions, this is a tool for being able to channel something else that gets you out of this.
that's a good point.
Because right now I'm looking at it and I'm like, these are really, these are interesting and they speak to something very real, but there's something about the way that it's laid out where my brain kind of slides off of it in some way as well. Do you know what I mean by that?
Well, it's like, what can I do about it? It's almost like the instructive element of it.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's like,
It's always been there. It's always frustrated me as well. I built the system and it helped me understand some of my own problems, but it's not like the problem evaporates once you understand it. Like you can start working on it effectively and addressing it. But like, I wish Eristics, I wish you could read it and understand it, and then you're cured, everything was better. But it's really just there to kind of help you with your own emotional slog. It's still going to be tough. Well, no. But if you know stuff like cigarettes and alcohol aren't great for my disgust addiction, like I'm actually narcissistic, and these substances I'm doing are helping get that same reward. So you get weird interactions there where if you don't have that reward, you start acting more narcissistic to fill in for the substance. Disgust is really interesting, substance wise.
can you say more about that?
Well, so I speak about emotions and emotions towards, those are kind of like endogenous chemicals. Exogenous chemicals made outside our brains, can provide the same categories of rewards. So an anger addict, for example, might be an angry person. You talk to them and they just feel viscerally angry. But they also might be a gambling addict, because gambling provides a lot of the same emotional rewards as anger. That's still an endogenous reward, so it's not a good example. But cocaine would be a good proxy for anger. So you know a guy that he's angry, he gambles, he goes to cocaine, and it seems like that's like this pattern you see over and over. Anger is the underwhelming thing.
I tend to remove those guys from my life pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think they make it easy. That's for sure.
And
There's
so
a lot of tragedy there.
Yeah. So what is the interplay between disgust and substances?
So disgust is really fast. It's like the self-duality is kind of like a very small, fast emotion. And what we get from it feels like it comes to us because it's so fast. Whereas cognition, which is what I call the thinking/feeling associated with fear and anger, that's slow. That feels like when we sit down, we're I'm going to think about things. That's cognition. Intuition, which is what I call the thinking/feeling associated with love and disgust, happens so fast that it seems to come to us. When it comes to intuition, you want a small system that has very few connections. Like we only have 5 people in the group associated with love and disgust. You want that to think like on a verge of sub-response time, like milliseconds. And then cognition's a little bit slower. I think it's like 5 times slower. But it has more connections. You can have like 25 peer-ender connections, which is, you could think of it as like a workplace would be the easiest modern interpretation, like the 25 people you work with at work. And then guilt pride takes the longest. It kind of takes a whole day, as we discussed with dreams and stuff, where it's actually active. It takes a long time to put things together, but it also has a lot of connections. It has 125 connections.
What do you mean? What do you mean by 125 connections? Or like the 20 connections or the 5 connections?
They're people. They're
literally like the amount of people that you can extend this to?
Yes. And it's in general. Some people are going to have more capacity for loving discussers, but it's not going to be the 5,000 members of your cult. You know, you might claim it is. Yeah, so we're all part of my shared self. But truthfully, if you're really good at it, you might have like 8 people that you can tolerate in a shared self. But we all only have so much time in the day. Only have so much time, emotions to feel, experiences that actually have. That having a really huge shared self isn't feasible or useful for our brain. So why would you motivate that? The numbers that I've observed are 5, 25, and 125. And if you add them all up, you get a number close to Dunbar's number. Here's the psychologist that looked at brain sizes and predicting how large our social group should be. It's around 150. And yeah, some of those are shallow connections, like acquaintances through guilt and pride, are basically the people in society. And then some of them are coworkers, which is the people in worlds. And then some of them are family, friends, loved ones, which is the people in self.
And so which is the one that is discussed, the one that has the greatest number of connections?
No, it has the smallest.
It has the small. Okay, so love and disgust have the smallest number of connections.
Yes, that's 5.
And then fear and anger have the 20 connections.
They have 25. Yeah, so 25. It just multiplies by 5. I don't know why the number 5 shows up over.
Okay, and then guilt and pride are the ones that have the largest number of connections.
Right. So those are like basically everyone else in the triad. And so the people you might run into.
And is that because like guilt and pride is by its very nature an externalized thing?
I think it has to model the society that you live in. You could really call it the tribal emotion if you don't want to call it the societal emotion. I definitely think we see the limits on that in society. Because there's definitely more than 150 people around. Like there's very quickly, no matter where you live, too many people to actually connect to all around you. So I think in that sense, guilt and pride, it's like superficial relationships. It's the shallowest relationships, but they're still a shared sense of self. It's just the self is much larger, less exclusive. Because it doesn't have disgust as a gatekeeper.
It's really interesting because there is this sense of, we talked a little bit earlier about the sense of being overwhelmed by the lives that we lead right now. And the idea that if you have guilt and pride that can be extended only to a relatively small number of people, and that group has to be relatively well bordered in order for you to actually be able to formulate a functional response to the argument, right? Because if the idea is that the emotion is the argument that drives you to then make an action in order to respond to the argument, then if you have a well-bordered society of the 125 that you can actually model and parse and act upon, then you can deal with your guilt and pride in a way that's relatively functional. But if you're living in a world where you're surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of people all the time, how do you choose which group you're obligate to, especially as you're traveling
Yeah.
from, your neighborhood where you live to your workplace to like where you hang out in the evenings. These are all really disparate societies where there's almost no overlap. And so
And
it's a deeply exhausting process of figuring out what is the rule set for each one of these and how do I take actions to actually fulfill that obligation that I experience.
Yeah. And it's kind of a sliding spectrum we have to live in, where you can live like a real life where those 125 people are people, they are individuals. And then you probably know their names. You probably have some sort of basic interaction with them. Maybe you sit on the grocery store with them. That's one side of the spectrum. The other side is where we start filling 125 slots where we describe as representations of people. So we would just think, oh, well, there's a middle-aged working Asian professional, and that's like one of the 125 people in a society. But it's not it's not Bob. Like it's a group. It's like a stereotype.
It's like almost a stereotype. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why we stereotype. It's how we get by. We're crunching more and more information down into those 125 people, which, as we get more and more disconnected from real living, more of those are just stereotypes.
It's really interesting.
Which really is another harsh word, but it's the best word for it.
I mean, I have a whole can of worms I want to crack open about the concept of detachment.
A brief interruption. I have to ask you to come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and help support the podcast by donating a couple of dollars a month. It is absolutely key for us so that we can keep making really interesting conversations where we have the luxury of time to actually study the people that come on the show, be able to hire somebody who can help us with booking, and it helps us get in touch with our audience because we host a fantastic Sunday chat, which you are invited to if you become a patron. So come on over to patreon.com/demystifysci and I'll see you there.
I wanted to talk about something tangential to this a little bit and see what you think about it. So detachment is a really central concept in my own life, and it has been for a number of years now. And it's something that I really focus on when I think about emotionality, because when I was younger, in my 20s, I was much more prone to being led around by my emotions. And I felt like it was kind of destroying my personal relationships and just not making me the best version of myself. And I've become really obsessed with this idea of feeling something and then trying to put a few microseconds of analysis between that feeling and my action output as a result of it. But it's not always a good thing, because if you are perceived as too detached, it can alienate people, especially loved ones, right? They're freaking out about something and you're just sitting there contemplating how to act on the emotions that you're experiencing. It can come across as cold or calculating or, something like that. And so in terms of instrumentalizing the knowledge that we gain from a personality test like this, how does detachment fit into this in terms of actually moving forward productively as an emotional being in a world of other people? Do you experience this in your own life? I don't know, just like person to person. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's something I've observed. Again, it comes back to the three fear dominant archetypes, our three archetypes. When you're on the left side of the emotional spectrum, the lower energy emotions, they're often starting emotions. Like most of the archetypes start with love or fear. Only two of them start with guilt, and none of them start with disgust, anger, or pride. It's because the lower energy emotions are easier to feel. The problem comes is that what happens is you have to start with either your left foot or your right foot. You have to start with either love or fear. So if you are a type of person who starts with fear, because of the way emotions rise in energy, and the next emotion is going to be something more energetic. It can be any emotion except for love, the emotion of the self. the emotion that connects us to the people closest to us. So basically what happens with the fear dominant archetypes is, they tend to go back to the fear containing emotions of anxiety and duress and regulation. And the leftmost column, the first checkbox, or the 6 checkboxes, is basically left unchecked. No matter where they go with the emotion, where they land it, they're not satisfying love. So love and fear are kind of exclusive in that regard, except of course for the emotional attachment, which is a combination of love and fear. But notably, it's not fear and then love. So if you are the type of person who views the world analytically, like if you're a dominant archetype, cognitive thinking type, you're always going to want to start with fear, and that bypasses love. So it's hard to go back and then feel love because you're so used to starting off every beat with fear.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's interesting because I feel like the thing that gets me out of that rut is, so it's like I tend to be very zealous. I think Shiloh has in arguments called me an extremist on multiple occasions.
Terrorist?
Terrorist, yeah. And I think that the thing that gets me out of it is that I'll be like, fine, I'm going to go away and I'm going to think about this. And it's always, I go back to the primary feeling of love.
Okay.
Where it's like, okay, and it's love that's tinged by fear, because the process by which I clarify this is I'm like, okay, what if this is our last interaction? Right? And, like he goes to the grocery store and gets in a car crash on the way. Is this really how I want to leave it? Like, is whatever like primary raw emotion that I'm experiencing right now the totality of the situation?
Yeah.
And it's incredible because it diffuses it almost instantly. Like whatever.
It's funny because my detachment is a completely different experience. I go back to, is this really the most effective way to achieve the ends that are desirable in this situation?
It's so funny because I'm like, are the ends really that desirable? I'm like, is it worth it? I'm like,
that's the guilt pride difference. Guilt always seeks to find a balance, and pride seeks to find an optimum.
Interesting.
Best up.
A self-optimum.
Yeah, because for me, I'm oftentimes just like, I'll lose this battle. I don't care. Like, it doesn't matter to me because the war is more important. And and so much as like these, the campaign or the ultimate, je ne sais quoi.
But it's interesting because I feel like the emerging on the other side and starting from the emotion of love is almost always the greatest path to diffusion for me. And it's like I can if I start to think about maintaining the campaign or the war, that just gets me even more fired up in general, because then I start to scheme and strategize of like, okay, well, what is the most effective way of doing this? The argument must continue. I must get the other person to be able to see where I'm coming from.
Well, the campaign of the war for that, like say if I'm having an argument with my wife, it's that the ultimate goal is to have an incredible, loving relationship with my wife. And so that's the war. It's like, that's winning that. Like, that's the win. And so I'm like, is this, particular minutia really contributing to that? And so the answer is no. But I feel like I didn't totally get an answer from you about detachment. Like, what's the role of detachment in having a healthy mental life, like a healthy emotional existence? Do you see a role for that? Does having this system help us to see what's going on when we do detach so that we can get into action quicker?
I would say that Anastasia's advice is exactly what Eristics would say to do, which is just to go back and feel all those emotions containing love, which is attachment, devotion, frustration, and satisfaction. And if you feel those, it'll kind of scratch the luggage. You also do hacks like getting a pet. It doesn't have to be like complicated life strategies. Sometimes it's just literally sectioning up your day and thinking of it in terms of hours. I think can help some people.
I mean, I think that with detachment, there is a danger of completely abandoning the emotional landscape. right? Like, and I find this to be the case for men and boys more than for girls and women, where it's like sometimes I'll ask a male friend, like, what do you feel about this? And they're like, I don't really have any feelings.
Hidden.
And I'm like, I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
And I think that there is this learned social detachment of, well, I'm not experiencing a feeling here. Like, I remember
Yeah.
the other day I was arguing with somebody, and we were arguing about what it means to have your feelings hurt. And it's like, okay, so if you lose your favorite hat and you experience sadness at losing your favorite hat, I think that where you experience a sense of loss, I'm like, I think it's fair to say that your feelings are hurt.
Yeah.
But I think that that's not the way that anyone would ever talk about it.
I would totally talk about it that way. But maybe you're right. Maybe people in general wouldn't.
I feel like people take these emotions that have to with like I think that it's hard for people to put labels on the things that happen inside of them. I feel like there is this division between the physical body and the emotional body.
Yeah.
Well,
People construct like a laboratory in their head and then put the experience they had in that laboratory and like, here's what happened. Here is the emotion I felt. But you're right. There's a disconnect because that laboratory emotion inside our head, that thing that's creating that mental image, is all made out of fear. But fear is the emotion driving that. The same emotion we use to say, "Hey, that's a big tiger. It has these dangerous claws," is also the emotion that lets us analyze stuff. So once we analyze a memory, we say, "Well, no, that's what happened." But we have to realize that in the moment that we're feeling anger, for example, it's really tough to us because fear is not available. Fear is the opposite argument, and it's not home right now. You're feeling anger. Anger is going to feed you conclusions about how the world is with the same certainty that fear feeds you conclusions. So if you have a really strong fear duality and you never feel angry, you might think, oh, well, I've conquered anger. Well, no, you're still building a need for it. And when the need strikes and you feel anger, it's going to overwhelm you. You're going to be really bad about it. And worse is that your cognitive system, which is really good and really refined and you've learned to trust, is now working against you with that same level of certainty that you had in your other sense of self in fear, your sense of the self and world in fear versus anger, where anger is like, well, I'm the bigger thing and I'm going to destroy what I'm looking at. And anger doesn't view people as like people in their extended self. It doesn't view them as the people in their extended societal self, even as like acquaintances. It views you as other people in the workplace. But really on the tribal level, the workplace isn't the workplace. The workplace is like outsiders in the battlefield and stuff like that. It's just stuff where the physical comes to a head. Work is our civilized modern version of it. But in the ancient world, it would be, the people you fought a lot of the time.
And so with that, I feel like fear is, so we have love as the primary emotion, and we can all agree that love as the primary emotion is kind of what makes people normal and satisfied, right? They're probably less complex, they have less neuroses, they have less weird stuff going on, because they're able to...
It has the best energy proposition. A lot of it, because if we help family members, that's energy efficient, because then they don't fall behind and they can take care of themselves. But also because it like literally governs food. So it's like you actually directly get calories from it. So love is like a low energy, easy emotion. And
it's like a stable confirmation.
Yeah, because it involves intuition, which so it seems like a belief that comes to you. Whereas if you get lost, you get detached. You're only going to use fear-containing emotions. They don't have that reassurance.
And so in the model of the world that I built before I came across this test, I was like, I think that love and fear are the two primary experiences, and everything else is built on top of those.
Oh, absolutely. So in my system, I do treat guilt as its own full third duality because I think it's useful in modeling emotions. But the truth is, I'm probably modeling the nuance of an underlying simpler system that just uses love and fear. And what guilt actually is, if you wanted to look at it from like a neurobiological point of view, I would say that guilt is probably what happens when literally both systems are active. And it works as almost like a tiebreaker or a combination of the other two in most of what I've seen. Like a combination of a tiebreaker or a governor in general.
What does guilt mean for you, by the way, just in your definition set?
So guilt is what models society. So it would be like what we think of as our greater society. And it also models our place in that. So it drives us to be a meaningful contributor in that sense. So if we think of guilt as those 125 acquaintances, whether they're actual individuals or whether they're stereotypes, you want to be like an average contributor in most terms, in the sense of guilt. Pride is like, I want to be one of the best, and everyone should do the best. That's how we should be able to do it. But guilt is like, everyone should do their fair share.
Interesting. That's the one I've thought about the least in my life, I feel like, is guilt. I'm trying to understand that word itself.
Guilt's kind of a weak point for both of our archetypes. Like, I definitely know what you're talking about.
Completely obscure etymology,
that is so
too.
hilariously foreign to me.
Yeah.
Where I feel like guilt, I mean, I don't know if it's, I grew up in like a Soviet Jewish household, and so I feel like guilt was a massive feature of the world. And Shiloh grew up, what were you, like, Lutheran?
Heathens. No, yeah, we're Lutherans.
And I feel like this idea of the Old Testament God and the guilt that is associated with the violation of social rules and the obligation that one has to the collective is something that doesn't appear in these New Testament teachings.
It comes from something like debt, as far as I can tell. It's actually a really, really obscure etymology for that word. But it's I think goes back to the Germanic world, but something about debt or offense. I see that I can see that as being in relation to what is owed to a society or to a system of governance.
And when we feel it strongly, we usually owe a lot. But that emotion is at a low level active all the time.
I feel like the main place people encounter that word is in the judicial system.
Yeah. But its pairing is with pride. It's not with not guilty. So I feel like it's different than that. But it is the same guilt. And I would say that debt is a good proxy word.
And so I can see why you added it as a third beat to these primaries, right? Because it's like the fear and the love are primarily, I think, self-centered in some way.
Oh, yeah.
And then the guilt is the way that those self-centered emotions then begin to be projected onto the network of relationships.
Projection's a great way to describe it. I mean, mathematically, it might like literally be math and projection and different concepts.
Can you flip the screen over?
Eristics is kind of describing it. Anyway, yeah.
Shelley wants to show something. Hold on.
Yeah, I went to the Wikipedia page for guilt, and there's a sculpture at the top that I thought really reflects a feeling that we've all had from time to time. I feel like I do this quite a bit, actually.
Actually, I think I've seen you in that exact same pose on numerous occasions.
So I guess I can identify with that.
But it's interesting that that's not a universal primary experience, because I'm like, I have no idea how one lives in the world without being really deeply connected with a sense of guilt.
So we view it more as a sense of alignment, and we try to focus on where we align, because we don't generally conform by default. So it's more like we usually think of our own moral code as like a superset that checks all the boxes of society's moral code. But it's a very like practical thing. It's like it's a worldly thing. It's not like self as morals. It's not like taking an idea that we were talking about earlier and making it a part of yourself isn't one code. And talking about the actual fear and anger as well. Yeah,
How does purpose fit into all of this as a motivator?
I mean, I would say the ultimate underlying purpose of the system is survival. But paradoxically, as humans, we want to experience like a state of non-survival where none of the emotions that we're using are actually towards the end of survival. Like we feel them and we satisfy them, but we're never actually running away from a tiger. We're never using it to actually survive. That's what I define as happiness. And I think there are three arenas for happiness. So if you check all three boxes, all three dualities, I'd say that's something like total happiness. But as we know, it's feeling.
So purpose would be feeling like you are on track to survive some situation, some
I would
life
say
arc.
purpose is the guilt and pride chunk of what I was just talking about, where it's like our self in society, like how we're helping the group ultimately.
Mm.
I mean, some people do have like a direct like environmental purpose, and if you talk to them and you're like, oh, so you're because it's humanity's environment and you want to help the environment that we live in, and you're like, no, I like the environment, like the humans of and it's the environment that I'm seeking to preserve and protect. There's definitely a difference in motive between those two dualities, the world duality and the society.
There's something about purpose that seems to be at the heart of a lot of pathology, right?
Or meaning as well, right? Which I think
synonym maybe.
I don't think that they are. I think that purpose is external and meaning might be internal. Right? Because you could be doing something that's useful for the world. You could be coding at some company, you could be working on some project that's really purposeful, where you're every single day working on something that has clear external purpose, but it might not be meaningful to you.
I think I'm more referring to meaning than in this case.
Because meaning is such an internal orientation.
Yeah, I think meaning can be found in more places, like especially places where you don't have a choice. So if you don't have a choice, you might not feel like whatever you're doing is your purpose, but you can still find meaning in it. Even if you're suffering, you can still find meaning. Whereas, I mean, if you are directly suffering, you're not going to be like, this is my purpose. I'm here to sit in a hospital bed and clutch my kidney. That's not going to be your purpose, but you can still pull meaning from that experience. Just to, wow, I really value my health more now. And so, yeah, I think just in terms of like what's available, I feel like meaning is a lot easier to get a hold of.
And meaning, and that's the deficit of meaning seems to be a real source of pathology from what I can tell. You hear about soldiers going to these wars overseas and then becoming kind of disillusioned, like, what the hell are we doing here? They come back, they've seen horrific things, and it's a very different situation than guys coming back from World War II who are just like, yeah, we just kicked the Nazis' asses. This is great. Yeah, my buddy's head blew up next to me and that was horrible, but I'm somehow able to go on because it was a meaningful experience. The same thing, you see it in healthcare. People go into medicine and then they get disillusioned sometimes. They're like, what the hell? These drugs aren't making people better. What am I doing? It seems to just be really at the heart of people's ability to carry on.
So yeah, the emotion involved there is pride, and you can't pull pride apart from the society duality. So, like, the very individualistic archetypes will tend to have a problem where they aren't successful by traditional social metrics, but also those metrics aren't generally important to them. But that can kind of be like a continuously reinforcing cycle. I don't know where meaning and purpose falls into that, but I would say that meaning exists across all three dualities, and purpose is one of them. Society.
Meaning's the thing you can entrain to. Have you read Viktor Frankl's book?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So that had a huge impact on me when I was younger. And this is almost like detachment. It's something you can train, I feel like. You can train yourself to orient towards meaningful experiences in whatever
Yeah.
you're doing, right? Whether you're in the hospital bed or you're choosing how you're going to lay your day out.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in the elements of this that are trainable, that can orient us towards a better version of ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of experience and outlook. Like you have to actually experience some form of duress, and then you have to do it with a certain outlook, which isn't shut off feeling great from the experience. And I think you see people chasing stuff like this everywhere, where they do extreme sports or they just do crazy things. Tell people about it. It's very much like an Archetypes and all that. It's very much satisfying pride. It's a hard emotion to satisfy. And
It's
especially
also overcoming fear, right? To some extent. I mean, I know of the extreme sports. Like, I got really into rock climbing specifically because I was afraid of heights.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't want to be a person who's afraid of stuff. So I'm going to beat this. And it did. And it was pride. I guess then I get prideful satisfaction from that because, like, I'm a person who can overcome these things.
Right.
So I tell that story to myself.
Yeah.
But I feel like meaning comes from, it might actually be born primarily out of love. Like if I was to diagram it out and I think about the things that are meaningful, it's usually the nurturing of something from nothing. It's like the taking care of a pet, the taking care of children, the growing of a garden, the starting of a business that's yours and yours alone. It's like it's these labors of love that produce meaning that must begin from a really like very low energy state of, okay, I'm going to do something for the world that I believe in. And it's a lot more soothing to believe in something that begins from a place of love than it is to spend all of your time operating from fear or guilt or occupying, anger or even pride. Like, I think that pride might get in the way of meaning because you hear...
What about the element of difficulty?
Element of difficulty.
Like, difficult ordeals tend to be quite meaningful across the board. Right, like you do this Grand Canyon hike or you, whatever it is.
So check it out. So this is really interesting. I do every year, I work for a guiding company and we do a charity hike in the Grand Canyon, rim to rim to rim. So you leave from the South Rim, it's like 24 miles, 4,000 feet of gain. You sleep on the other side and then you wake up in the morning and you walk back. And everybody who's there has raised money for cancer or multiple sclerosis research because they know somebody who's been affected by it or they themselves have gone through it. There's one lady that I'm thinking of who actually has multiple sclerosis who has done the hike. And every year, there's people who make it half the way. They get to the North Rim and they tap out.
Yeah.
And it's just too hard, or their feet are too screwed up, or they're not prepared, whatever. And there's a massive distance between the amount of meaning that they experience versus the people who complete both legs of the hike.
Interesting.
And I think that there's something in meaning that has to do with the completion and the overcoming of the suffering. Where if you simply suffer, there's not meaning in suffering. There's meaning in being able to suffer and to contain it and to overcome it, and then all of a sudden you can get something from it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the actual concept is detached. I think the actual concept of meaning and suffering is its own thing. But because we experience so much of it through the society duality, and so much of our understanding of it, it's invariably attached to society. So there's always some measuring stick. There's always some joint definition of suffering. So yeah, if you do a marathon with all your friends and you actually only do the half marathon, then you actually don't participate in that collective suffering. So there's less reward to actually get.
And you fail, and in the most simplest form, like you failed at the stated objective, which is to complete the marathon. And so there is something about the being able to ride the full arc of it.
Yeah. A lot of people are much better at talking themselves out of it.
Oh, interesting.
Like it's not as much of a measurable truth to them. So they'd be more likely to say, marathon half full, glass half full.
I love that. I guess I do see that. So it's the other hikes that I lead are basically they amount to wilderness therapy for middle-aged ladies. So it's these like women's only backpacking trips on the PCT, and everybody's coming because they have some thing that's happened in their lives, and they mark it as a transition point. And just by spending 4 days with people, I can start to see these orientations of love versus fear and guilt. And the people who don't end up finishing, who need to get, evac'd early, who don't really suffer over it, do seem to be the ones that are primarily love-oriented. They're just kind of like, I tried, I did my best. I got this far. It's totally fine. It's great.
Yeah. A lot of people will use like the inner child metaphor to kind of get you to ask questions about how you treat yourself. But like if you had an inner child and it was just you, but it was the child version of you, like what would you say after you failed? It would be something blood-oriented. You would not be like, it's 26.2 miles and you did 13.1, and that's half. Now you're half as good as you should be, measurably, and it's terrible. Whereas the love argument is more like, you're still good, you're still valid.
Good job, honey.
It's so interesting because I wonder about that. Like, I grew up in a house where it was very much, again, Soviet parents, like very, there's a bar for success, you'll meet the bar for success. And I chafed under it a lot when I was younger. And now when I think about the inner child narrative, because it's become very popular, I feel like internal family systems is kind of a version of that. Internal family systems, for anybody who doesn't know, is a therapy modality that kind of breaks up the various parts of yourself into family members and allows you to heal the dynamics between them by actually engaging with who these people represent and then curtailing their most negative impulses.
That's right. Perspectives are hard to keep track of, so it sounds like a system.
Yeah, exactly. I think that I've been meaning to actually find somebody to talk to about this because there was an article that came out recently that was like, one of the problems with IFS is that occasionally you end up discovering that people have demons living in them. And I've really been wanting to explore that.
How do we get that in the family? There's also the problem of some people just won't acknowledge that they have internal voices.
Well, I think some people don't.
Right.
Like my brother, I'm like, how I was talking to him and I was like, how you have these like multiple perspectives in your brain and you have to kind of like negotiate between them? He's like, no. I was like, what do you mean no? He's like, no, there's just one voice. And my instinct is I'm like, you're not listening closely enough, but I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I think that there might be some people that are just so fully integrated that there's just them.
I've tried not to think about this a lot. I feel like it's one of those things that will drive you crazy because it's like if you do only have one voice in your head, can it do impressions? Like, can it sound? And we're not talking about actual sound here. We're talking about perception of sound. I try not to think about it because some people think like in images, some people think in language, and some people think like what's like oral language versus written language. I haven't personally observed any patterns. Like I can't say, this archetype is the one that like imagine things in the head. But there is an archetype like that. Like that, those connections definitely do exist. I try not to focus on them too much or think about them too much. Well, partially because it's easy to say, this is wrong with you. This isn't correct. Like it's really easy to do that in a personality test. It's much, much harder, like 10 times harder. To be like, here's what you should do to proactively address your problems. So lately I've been trying to focus more on that and less of here's what could be wrong with it. But I still see stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Not what's you either.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm like really hot on this instrumentalization thing, of course, being an architect and everything. And so I really want, one thing that I'm completely obsessed with at the moment is how to accelerate my ability to connect with people when I first meet them. And I'm wondering if there's something that I can learn from this about my own personality type to help myself welcome other people's ideas in, or how do I, like, say I meet that wizard, like it's, my gut instinct might just be like blow this person off, or I'm not going to connect with this person. So
Why bother?
screw them. Yeah. But how do I overcome that? Or is there some insight that you've gleaned into how we can deepen our connections with people by understanding our own emotional landscape better?
There's 4 paths basically, and it's all the love-containing emotions. And the first one would be attachment, which is love and fear. And I think the lesson for fear dominant or guilt dominant people there is to not go to attachment too much to satisfy fear. Because it can kind of be like clinginess, and how much fear we need kind of outstrips how much love we need. So it can kind of be like an easy to abuse emotion. And of course, the people abused are the other people in our shared self. There's also devotion, which is the combination of love and guilt. So that's kind of like getting on the other person's wavelength in terms of like societal dynamics or group belonging, and kind of finding out where you're the same perspective wise as they are. This is hard to do in our society these days because it's like you voted for Ralph Nader, like what we're now mortal enemies for some reason. Like you've violated something sacred. But yeah, you can do devotion. It's harder. You can do frustration, which is like overcoming things together. So like a ropes course is kind of a good corporate example of drawing out frustration people and getting them to bond. And you can do satisfaction, which is the harder to achieve one I talked about before, which is love and pride. I'm not sure what the conversational example of that would be, because how do you... I'm also a gold medalist from the Olympics. Like, I'm not sure how that conversation would go, but it'd be something big,
like having kids or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, anything that combines the self argument and then the activizer. Try here.
It's interesting that you say that the love argument is the primary mode, because that's always the frame that I've operated under, where I'm like, the goal of a conversation is to find some way to nurture this shared love for something. And that's kind of what we do. And so I think that it's tricky when we sit down with somebody that we've, only spoken to for maybe 20 or 30 minutes beforehand. And the goal is to be able to have this extended conversation where we're playing with ideas and we're exploring the same space. And everybody has to be very comfortable for that, because there has to be the assumption that there's not going to be a discovery halfway through where they reveal something about themselves and then we turn on them. And so with academics, you see this all the time where they're very cagey because they're worried that if they say something, the audience will turn on them, or that perhaps we will turn on them where, oh, well, you said that incorrectly. I don't think that's accurate. Or whatever else. And so it's always this game of figuring out how to put somebody at ease and parsing the love emotions as being the lowest energy conformation lines up with that really neatly, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to relax them. You're trying to get them into this basal state where it's very chill and nothing to worry about. It's going to be great. Don't worry, we're going to go on this adventure together, and we're going to come out the other side, and it's going to be a great thing that we've done. Yeah.
That's actually not something the scientist needs. So it's cool that you recognize it, because it's actually a need of the other two fear dominant life types. Like, they're the ones that need to really focus on this. Like, this strategy seems obvious to you, but to me and Shallow would be less obvious.
What is it about the scientist?
None of this is obvious to me. I've had to piece this all together. It's been really quite a struggle, honestly.
You've totally worked.
Yeah. Hey, how many scientists are actually scientists by personality? Do you have any idea?
I haven't looked into it too much, but it seems like a pretty big overlap. And career-wise, it's probably the biggest one.
Because I have this bigger model that's kind of a bit of a tangent, but It seems to me like the motivation to become a scientist and the things that drive really just why you want to do science when you're 10 years old are very different from what happens when you become a professional scientist. Maybe you're a professor, you got grants to write, you're basically a high-end administrator for most of your time, and if you're lucky, you've carved off a little bit of time for science. And we were reading David Graeber's book Utopia of Rules the other day, and he talks about how it's kind of bizarre that the scientists complain, like professional professors, let's say, complain a lot that they don't get to do science as much as they'd hoped to. But he says that's a little silly because you've been selected all along the way for your ability to follow rules and do administrative things, essentially. And so what you've done is selected scientists who aren't really scientists as much as they are great administrators, because they can check all the boxes, they can be part of the committees, they can know all the right people, shake all the right hands. They've got themselves one of these coveted tenure positions. And so that was kind of why I asked that question, is I wonder how many scientists actually end up professionally as scientists, or if they find themselves more drawn to things where they can exercise their love of science better outside of an institutional position.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where the society stuff, the institutional stuff, is just inherently part of the argument that's useful for analyzing and get information. So the same argument that helps us manage those 125 shallow relationships also helps us manage navigating complex topics that we find in science. So because it's the same argument, yeah, you're going to get an institutionalizing effect just because the people who are good at guilt are going to be good at both things. They're going to be good at the analyzing complexity that they find in the field, and they're going to be good at managing the social stuff. Even if they're not good at interpersonal communication, which is the self-argument stuff, which is separate, will still be good at overcoming what they need to get what they need. Like the grants, for example. They'll understand what a grant is and that they need to get it to keep going. They'll be good at that.
It's wild, though, because I feel like the most accomplished scientists are these beloved people, right? I feel like they do have this preternatural ability to work the room and make friends everywhere.
I think that this might be this dimension of passion, because I think that that's because. So I was looking at the section which is emotional strategies, and you have the scientist as complementing this anxiety and zeal with passion. And it seems to be the same for the architect as well, but earlier you said that that was something that was more easily available to the scientist versus the architect.
It is more easily available to the scientist, I think. Just because they're going to be better at attachment, and they're going to be better at devotion, and those are both low energy, they're both right there. So basically, in general, guilt will be a lot easier and pretty satisfying along its 11th period.
Interesting. And so I think that the people that are the most revered scientists do have a way of harnessing the passion, and that draws people in because everybody wants to be associated with something passionate because there's meaning, there's purpose, there's all these higher order feelings of satisfaction and curiosity and motion too. I don't know if you've seen these studies that seem to show that the perception of motion improves mood.
Like walking or driving?
How do you mean?
Yeah, like so they've again, I might be misrepresenting this, but there was a really short blurb that I remember seeing somewhere where it's literally the perception of forward motion. So they would put people into some kind of VR situation where it looked like they were moving forward. And the perception of moving physically through the world seemed to make them feel better.
Interesting. Yeah, and maybe it scratches the narrative itch, like it's prideful sensation almost. Like you're literally going somewhere, so you're satisfying the narrative emotion.
It makes sense. In terms of problem solving, it makes sense. I think that's why walking is really good. You're like moving through it.
But I feel like we all want to be associated ultimately with something that's going somewhere. Because what's the worst? What's the worst, most depressive feeling? It's the feeling of stagnation. It's the feeling of being stuck. It's the feeling that renewal is unavailable to us.
Maybe.
And so, someone who's able to cast the spell of drawing you into something that's pushing you forward, or pulling you forward, or allowing you to make some kind of transformation, is a really valuable person to orient yourself around. And so, when you say that the most successful scientists are those who are beloved, it makes perfect sense, because science is a dynastic process. If you have an idea and you put it out into the world and nobody ever picks it up, it's just like one step above not having the idea.
Yeah.
And so those two things must have a massive interplay that I've never really thought about before.
Hey, so what dragons are you slaying with this project?
I feel like the project itself is my dragon to slay. And if I can get the right combination of words that easily explains it to most people, then I'll be on the dragon.
But in terms of the specific project itself, do you feel like there's this fear, uncertainty, doubt that arises from not having a grip on your emotional architecture?
No, I feel like it's just more information. So it just helps with certainty. I know. There is the matter of learning more, like knowing more of what you don't know. That's sort of like expanding field of question marks. But I feel like I was pretty humble about that going in. If I don't have like doctorate, I don't have 12 years of education on the line or anything. So I feel like it's easier for me to kind of throw myself at the problem. I mean, it completely.
Well, it's a really personally interesting point to me, because a lot of the things that I'm passionate about, science, for instance, right, how the atom works, this is something we spend a tremendous amount of time on. And I have a really hard time explaining to people why it matters, right? Because for me, it's curiosity based, and that seems important, right? That I understand how the world works in and of itself, regardless of any technological implementation of that knowledge. The motivation comes from just that desire to know, and I don't know how to communicate that all the time to people who seem to only value instrumentalization, technological application of scientific knowledge. And I have a really hard time putting that into words, why it matters. Who cares? Well, what do you mean, who cares? Like, don't you want to know how the atoms pull on you? Like, how does gravity work? Like, how do you not want to know that? And I have a really hard time crossing that barrier with people sometimes.
Yeah. It's really hard. It's really hard to get people to see beyond their emotional spectrum. And as someone who's mapped out all 9 of them, I feel like I'm really good at mine. A couple of the others sort of seem intuitively make sense to me. And then for the other people, it's all theory. Like, there's no intuition to it at all. Like, I'll be talking to a defender and I'll be like, oh yeah, so you should be like this. Are you like that? Because I haven't talked to one before. I don't know. And they're like, yeah, that's how I am. I'm like, well, that's just the theory is correct enough where it's predictive. So I can kind of fill in the gaps without confronting it, without actually talking to a person. I haven't had to do it in many places, but where I have it, it's worked. And it seems to be all there's a lot of context to it. I just went to an event where I tested a pretty big crowd, and almost everyone was a giver or a fixer, which is another like very very high guilt. It's basically the other 2 high guilt archetypes besides scientists.
What pool did you dip into to find a bunch of giver fixers?
The distributed web people.
Interesting.
So the people fighting corporate monoliths that we call the internet. So
interesting.
Wait, hold on. Tell me more about this. I don't really know much about that.
Okay, so the internet is distributed, which means that anyone can put up a website, have a website. And like when one website goes down, people can go to the other one. It's like a distributed system. But increasingly, it's become just a few different monolithic websites like Facebook and Instagram, I guess. Those are all actually done well themselves, I guess. But basically, it's all just becoming this big corporate behemoth where we're losing things like not being able to be tracked and stuff like that. So
Freedom
D-Web,
of speech.
it's a huge part of it. Or the distributed web tries to focus on technologies that decentralize it, the internet. So like peer-to-peer technologies. Napster is a good example of a D-Web, an old school D-Web technology. But we work a lot on stuff like governance systems and consensus. Some of it's kept track through a blockchain. Some people have other ways of keeping track of the information. But yeah, it's always a good crew, and yeah, they're very guilt conscious. They're very much a hugging crowd, and I'm not a hugging type person. And it's funny. I think that's probably measurable by a test.
Who are some of the names at the top of this movement? Are there people who are outspoken and recruiting attention to this?
Yeah, so some of the big names we've had are Tim Berners-Lee.
I've been trying to get him to come on the podcast, but he won't answer our emails.
Oh, yeah?
Interesting. Yeah, he wasn't at the most recent one. He invented the internet.
He invented the internet.
Yeah.
Good lord.
What do you mean, who is that?
Right.
He's the person that most qualifies for
I live under a rock.
title.
Yeah.
The inventor of the internet. Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, the truth is that it's been like a whole collection of all these different types of technologies. So it's hard to say one person invented it. But if you could say that, it would be Tim Berners-Lee invented the base protocols.
I mean, this is a question actually that we think about a lot, because I don't know how much you know about the, community policies at YouTube and the various sort of aggressive speech controls that are in place. Like, there's things that you just cannot talk about. Ideas that if you put in a YouTube video, it'll either get demonetized or it won't get shown. And so we're always trying to roll our heads around the question of, okay, well, what do you do instead? Yeah. And there's like a couple of other platforms, but they're not very powerful in the sense of distribution, or they're ideologically captured. Like if you go to Rumble or something, Rumble is such a hot mess. It's
even if you're not like that, people will just assume you're like that. Right. So how do you even fix the like that problem in the platform?
Exactly.
It's like this snowballs, and just stuck there.
And so you actually might be an interesting person to talk to about this. Like I've always, in conversation with Shiloh, been really fascinated by this idea of some version of an RSS feed that allows you to aggregate from all of these platforms into one place, so that you have a feed that contains Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and Rumble and all these other places, but you don't actually have to go there specifically to interact. And so it breaks the stranglehold, because
the death scroll.
Yeah, it breaks the death scroll, but it also gives you some power over the variety of sources that you have. But it seems like almost impossible, because these platforms are so...
you would have to chain them to the chair to make them do that.
It just seems like they intentionally don't want you to be able to like freely comment from anywhere.
Okay.
And so if you were accessing it from your own reader, you wouldn't be able to leave a YouTube comment or read the comments. You'd have to actually go to YouTube to do that.
Yeah. You would love DWebCat. They're always talking about ideas like this. I know. I think that was the original idea behind RSS. But it's kind of one of those things where the corporations will adopt the technology to grow and to use it to grow, and they eventually become huge, and then they drop it, like a bad habit, and it always leaves the technology in a lurch. Like it left RSS in a lurch when they got shunned by the corporations. So yeah, it's kind of always, that's what DWeb is. It's that struggle. It's the struggle between features like that and features that can break us away from that.
Who else could we talk to besides the guy who invented the internet?
Brewster Kahle would be there.
He's the library guy. He won't
answer. Librarian of the Internet Archive.
He won't answer our emails
Too
either.
big for us.
Yeah, I've tried multiple times, but I mean, the last time I emailed him, they were still like in the midst of their legal battle,
They've been pretty busy, yeah.
and so that might have been it. But yeah, he'd be really cool to talk to.
Yeah, it's just when you're in the middle of something like that, something like this is a minefield.
Oh my God,
like
yeah.
3 hours of talking on the record, oof, that's hard to do. And Brewster, he's a really passionate guy. So I think for him it would be tough because it would be like those bastards. It'd be a visceral response. But what you want to be is clinical and sterile and legal, like when it comes to stuff like that.
For sure.
Definitely hit him up after it's done or settled or whatever we'll term it.
What's the legal battle?
It would be great.
The legal battle is that they basically, all these publishers were suing them for having scans of books available on this internet library. Is that a decent summary?
Yeah.
Are we talking about LibGen?
No. So this is the Internet Archive. And so I'm sure that, so the Wayback Machine is part of the Internet Archive, but also I'm sure that you've looked up old books. The format of the page is that there's this like black viewer at the top and then like a bunch of download links. And so there's a bunch of books on there that have been scanned and publishers basically like wanted royalties.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's it was basically like it was during COVID, so already the atmosphere of decision making was like, okay, this is weird. But they basically opened up like a virtual lending system. Now I'm doing the legal dance. But basically, yeah, it was kind of giving away the books for free too much, according to the lawyers on the publisher's side. And yeah, now it's a pretty big lawsuit over a pretty big pile of IP. Damages done when it comes to IP. It's always ridiculous numbers. I don't know what the numbers are with this case, but I hope the archive is going to survive. The archive is going to they're going to look through it. I feel that's my opinion. But yeah, I think for the time being, it weighs heavy on Brewster.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
Publishers need to just give up and just realize that they're blacksmiths.
I mean, I just don't know how this. I don't know how the internet can survive being strangled by these massive platforms. Like, have you noticed how websites have kind of died?
Yeah. Oh, I have. Yeah, I used to be much more involved. I used to be, into forums and I had usernames I could rattle off the top of my head if I went to a forum. I'd be like, oh yeah, I know this user, and this user. And now I guess I'm on Twitter, and I sort of have that with a few people I interact with there. But that's a walled garden. It's not really a website at all. So I feel like the walled gardens have kind of eaten everything up. And the DO people are just kind of scurrying among the titans, trying to ensure that stuff still works outside of their system.
So you might be somebody who can answer this question. Is it possible for somebody to build a competitor to Google that actually reignites the culture of building websites? Because I feel like the big problem right now is that if you go to Google and you type something in, you get pages of just Harvard, Medline, Wikipedia, New York Times, Vox.
And blog clones.
Yeah, tons of blog clones, like a bunch of AI garbage at this point.
Yeah.
And there's this huge problem of discovery where you can't find something that's interesting because they're trying to serve you reputable results. And so you don't get the passion projects of the weirdo.
Same for YouTube, same for Spotify.
Yeah.
Like Arthur Russell records.
Oh my God, yeah. Spotify's music discovery is insane. I don't know if you ever use the For You playlists that they generate, but there's this one guy named Arthur Russell who shows up on every single playlist. It doesn't matter if it's a hip hop playlist, it doesn't matter if it's Boards of Canada playlist, doesn't matter if it's 70s rock and roll. At some point, if you listen to it long enough, Arthur Russell will absolutely show up. I don't know.
That's weird.
Who made what deal where?
Friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody's nephew, yeah.
I'll hook you up, yeah.
But so it's
It's funny though, we ask you, you have a lot of family that works at Google, and so we'll be like, hey, is it actually possible for somebody to make a competitor? And they're kind of No. I mean, at first their knee-jerk response is, yeah, of course, anybody could make a competitor. But then you're like, really? Like they would have the ability to compete on speed of return of results? Do they really have the server farms? Like, is that really possible?
Because I'm like, I think it's a discovery problem. Like, people don't make websites because they're like, well, nobody's going to find them either. It's a lot easier to go to Substack and build a Substack because that's got discovery built into it and it's got this user base and everything else. And so is there some like search-based approach that can circumvent that?
There's lots of, at the like technical level, there's lots of algorithms that can accomplish pieces and parts of it. But Google is so entrenched in that such a big moat that it's just, it's always hard to overcome the centralized tech with the decentralized tech because it's just by its virtue. The nodes are less powerful, so like Google will have whole facilities dedicated to computers. My distributed system might run on people's video cards, like individual computers. So in the collective system, we might have more horsepower. Actually utilizing it and putting it towards some task will be much harder for us because we're decentralized. And we basically, the problem you run into is when and where you update information. So pretty much every new technology comes out, it's like this different method of updating the information at the most basic level. So you'll have different libraries for accomplishing that, and then keeping the state same across however many people want to keep it same across. But it's a much different problem in the local actual tribe scale where you're talking about, where you might know 125 people. That network's a lot easier to maintain, both in the friendship relationship sense and in the computer science sense of networking. Like that network's a lot easier to do than Google scale, Microsoft scale, and Facebook scale stuff, which is like networks of millions and millions and even billions and billions if you're working on something like YouTube. So I'd say once you get to that scale, not only have you captured that audience, which is huge, but you also have the thing that can work with that scale, which is going to be really hard for anyone else. Yeah. Like even Amazon is struggling in terms of video. They own the infrastructure that Twitch runs on. So it's like video is still relatively expensive and people consume a lot of it. So I think that's the most interesting thing to look at is who captures video and what video wins. I like content like this where it's like chill and there's no swooping cameras or graphics. It's all very real.
Yeah, that takes far too much time for two people to be able to accomplish. So we've settled to the lower energy confirmation of just conversations.
Yeah.
I wonder if the future of the internet isn't kind of a return to the past in some ways, because I feel like before it got indexed really well was the time of the real proliferation of weirdos and the attractors of, you have the Usenet group that's deeply devoted to some topic and people seek out that group and they hang out there and that's just their internet.
Yeah.
And so
that's gone. The sense of nostalgia you're talking about is very common in the DSPod community. And I feel like people do capture pockets of it. Like sometimes a new protocol or tech will become kind of popular just in the community and everything will be different for a while, but eventually the tech doesn't meet the scale requirements or it just gets mysteriously shut down. I think if you have a large communication network that everyone's using, the government wants a backdoor somewhere. They want to install a closet in one of your buildings and they want to look at absolutely everything that goes to it. And I think every tech CEO that has had a company that gets to a certain size has that conversation with the government where it's like, hey, are you going to play ball? Because we need to look at your system to monitor it. Because but like people imagine like the search warrant situation playing out differently than it actually plays out, where it's like mostly automated now. It's not like, it's more of the judge is there and the judge rubber stamps whatever the system produces. And the system is what's actually defining things. It's not like people fighting, which is maybe what it should be if we don't want to live in a dystopia. So with DWeb stuff, what happens is you get these new networks, and people are like, finally we can communicate, and nobody's looking over our shoulder and our communications. And then it's like, do you want to buy some black tar heroin now that we're here? And it's like, no, that's not what I had in mind at all. I wanted to just communicate normally. I didn't want to do secret, like, anti-government or crime stuff. But those people are obviously attracted to networks that are new and wide-scale communications. So it's kind of this constant cat and mouse game where something can be free and open, or it can be big. And once it gets too big, it just can't be free and open, because those bad actors will basically set up shop there.
Sounds like the story of the United States to me.
Yeah, there's probably an underlying power dynamic being the strategy.
Well, it's interesting because I feel like small cultures tend to have very strict rules. And so if you have a free and open system, is it just anathema to the ethics of the system to say, okay, nobody's going to sell black tar heroin here, and anybody who does gets kicked off and forever blocked? Or is there just too many people trying to come in to sell black tar heroin to make that a possibility?
Well, how do you kick them off? How do you block them? Like, that's one of the questions of decentralization. If it's truly decentralized, you can't stop them from showing up and participating. And that's the whole point of the system. But then the other question is, once you set up a system like that, who shows up? And then you might have features like where you can block them directly, or you can block certain content, or certain content networks. But obviously, there's certain types of content where it's like a lightning rod. And everyone's in agreement. Like, even the open content people are like, well, not that content. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, that kind of stuff. Where everyone will agree, yeah, put this person in jail. But you have the best intentions in the world when you develop this new internet-saving, world-shattering technology. And then the worst people in the world are going to flock to it and use it if it's successful. So you have to be ready for that. You have to be ready to the ultimate question of, like, freedom versus security, where we're kind of losing over and over the freedom people.
Mm-hmm. It's really depressing.
Sorry, we should have talked about DWeb. That was the problem. Yeah, well, it's been a slog.
I mean, it's so pertinent, right? Because the internet was such a dream of free and open communication. And, you know, I started going online probably when I was like 10 years old. Like, my parents got me a laptop. My dad was a programmer, and he was like, here's a laptop. And it's just connected to the internet. And it was just, you know, forums and these weird places. I spent years in these online communities where it was a really discrete set of people that were always hanging out. We would have, you know, local meetups or whatever. And all of those communities are gone. And everything's kind of astroturfed for this single aesthetic that's become really popular.
Yeah.
And it just seems like this is the inherent nature of large money-making operations, where once people figure out how they can make money off of a technology, everything moves towards a single version. Like, we've been having a really interesting conversation with some of our patrons and some of the people in our Discord server, where they're like, you guys need to focus on a single topic on the podcast so that people know that the podcast is about, like, one thing. And that way you'll grow your audience. And I'm like, I understand that that's the marketing default for the world right now, but that seems to me as a creative person as anathema.
Yeah.
And yet that's the name of the game for basically anybody who's trying to come up with some platform to be able to attract an audience, is that there's a set of rules and you follow those rules and then you can reap the rewards of the money tree.
Yeah. Yeah, the audience question is always tricky. Like, the more unique and compelling your offering is, the trickier the audience question was going to be. I feel like my audience question is, do I want an audience? Again, my real goal is that violinists. I want to free up their time to focus on their real passion, so they don't have to waste time digging through psychology books or you know, figuring out what's wrong with them. I want to patch them up and get them back out into the world doing what they're doing. So it's like my passion is their passion. I'm probably not going to talk about it if I do like an internet presence thing. So it's kind of it's this weird question of who sticks around to hear your message, who sticks around to consume your content. I think, and I think you two are stuck in some kind of algorithmic whirlpool, or like I've seen creators snap out of that though, like in a moment, and become like huge breakout hits. And I feel like sometimes you get into like what you call like a local minimum, and in terms of the algorithm, you get kind of stuck.
I think it doesn't know how to bin whatever it is that you're doing. Like if you're constantly making like short, punchy videos about, I don't know, woodworking, then the algorithm can be like, okay, people love short, punchy videos about woodworking. Here's where you fit. And so but I don't know. I think that I'm a lot less depressed about it than I've ever been before. Because I think that people, there's a hunger for ideas. And people want to be able to understand the world. They want to be able to understand themselves. They want to be able to understand nature. And so whatever they can find that helps them do that, it grows by word of mouth, slowly but surely. It kind of is a thing. And
there's also
Eristics,
like a binge factor to it. Like as you have more of a backlog of content, the people that do discover you now have a lot more stuff to consume.
Yeah.
A lot of people like binge through it.
And so if you do something like this for Eristics, what do you have a sense of what the format would look like?
I think short, snappy YouTube videos. Like it'd be kind of the opposite of this. It'd be like what is narcissism in 60 seconds? It's an addiction through disgust. Here's how disgust works. You have to consider objects in your extended self, and then you have to reject them. Once you reject them, you get that emotional reward. That's why bullies will try to be your friends, and that's how narcissism works. Go to my test at eristics.com, and then it'll end. So I would do something short-sighted. It'd be completely opposite of your client. But I'm still looking to you for tips on like set design and keeping it real.
Yeah, that's the thing, because once you start having a script and then you're reading the script, it's hard to be good at reading the script without sounding like you're doing that. It's a real authenticity is in high demand.
Yeah, and I think it's all at least for our personality archetypes, there's like a component of masking to it. Really kind of take on like a love-based persona almost to interact with other people. So I feel like if you have a convincing persona, you can do really well. Adam Savage would be an example. That's the one of the Mythbusters. I feel like he has a kind of a TV persona that it's on the show. If you watch some of his more like behind the scenes, but then he's much more chill. So it's less of a TV ghost as personality.
Yeah, like we used to do shorter videos, and it was the persona that was really difficult to put on because I'm just really allergic to the TV host presenter persona.
Yeah.
And that's why we ended up doing long form podcasts, is that there's much less of a persona. Like this is how we have conversations. There's not some massive thing that I have to step into, some like suit that I wear for it.
Right. I think the opposite strategy is what's successful on YouTube. If you think of the big ultra creators, it's all persona used to act really fast. Like they're basically screaming into the screen over and over at this point. It's all anger and zeal. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I've been really reassured by the super fan model too, which is, I think this is a Tim Ferriss article a long time ago. I could be wrong about that.
I think it is,
Yeah. But it seems to have worked out for us to some extent. Like our ratio of patrons to subscribers on YouTube is kind of unheard of as far as I can see. And we've really focused on making something really focused on just doing what we love to do to the best of our ability, and we continue to obsess over that. And getting support, asking for support directly from the people that recognize that as valuable to them. maybe it's an old route, but I feel like this idea of patronage versus just having a huge microphone and lots of advertisers is, at least in our case, seems to be working. You know, it's allowing us to pay our bills without having this gargantuan audience, and in some sense, that's more desirable because you feel like you can really connect with the audience at this scale, right? I can actually have these meetings with my patrons every week and speak with them and meet them and get to know them, and you cross some boundary, right, where you have 1 million subscribers, and it just feels it seems kind of lonely and isolating at that point too. So while, you know, growth is important, it doesn't seem like it's the only route to success as a creator too. So that's something to think about.
I agree. You definitely want the passionate people who you can access as people, and not just as a faceless crowd that's just getting things done by virtue of just being sewage. Like you want people to have an impact that doesn't feel like they're just adding one to a bigger number. You want them to feel like you're listening to their feedback and I don't know, basically building a show with them, not just at them.
Exactly.
Yeah, that connection is really what it comes down to at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But hey, man, I guess we're almost at 3 hours, so we should probably let you get on with your day. And
tell people really quick where they can find the test.
yes.
The test is at eristics.com. That's ERISTICS, Eristics. You can go there. It takes usually about 5 minutes to take it, and it will give you a page that takes longer than 5 minutes to read.
And then, who are you on Twitter?
I'm at Eristic Rex on Twitter. I'm not using it too much. I'm trying to use it more. So if you follow me, that'll incentivize me to follow you back. Hopefully get on that platform more.
Very cool. All right, everybody should go take the test. It's very disturbing and enlightening in equal measures. So I appreciate you building such a thing and for taking the time to talk to us and walk us through all the ideas behind it.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rex. Good to meet you, man.
Nice meeting you.